Hello everyone, my name is Nikhil. So in this video, we will create a full stack bookstore application with the Next.js. So first we will create the API, then we will create the view of the application, then we will integrate it together, and then we will just create a full stack bookstore application with the Next.js. So let's start. So now I will show you the overview of the application. So now you can see, now we can see the demo of this application as well. So now you can see we are into the localhost at the rate 3000, and this is the URL of the application locally on our system. And then you can see currently we are into the home page of our application, and then you can see the home page is highlighted, and then you can see in the home page we have this featured section on our website, and then you can see in the featured section we have some featured books onto the website as well. So we have this book as the mindset, we have the quiet, we have the start with why. So we have 3 books at the featured section, and the books inside the feature section is also rendered into the page source of the HTML as well. So if you will just click Ctrl U on your application, and then you can see if you will just search for any book, like you can search for the mindset, so you can copy that, and then you can just move on to the page source. You can search for the mindset. You can see now, you can see all of the things are now rendered onto the page source of the HTML file as well. So it is very good for the SEOs as well, because it will detect all of the keywords inside our application, and then it will appear in the search engines as well. So now this website is fully SEO friendly, and then you can see we have some featured products, and once you will move on to the all books, you can just click on the all books, and then the request will be made to the server side backend, and the backend is built with this application only. So the request will be made to the backend, and then it will just give you these results. So all these pages are now server side rendered. So all these pages are now pre-rendered onto the web page. So if you will just click on the Ctrl U again, and then if you will search for the atomic habits here as well, atomic habits, so then you can see now you got the atomic habits as well inside that. So you got the atomic habits, and then you can see all of the data is now rendered into the HTML page as well. So in the start, in the home page, and in the all books page, all of the things are now pre-rendered. But if you will just click on the edit, and then you can see first we will load the page, then we will just fetch the data with the use effects. So this is the nice approach, because we don't need to pre-render the data inside this page. So here we will just render the page, then we will make a call to the API to fetch the data in the front end, and then we will fetch the data with the Axios. We will install the Axios, and we will use the Axios with that. And then you can see this is a featured book as the start with why, and then we can just move on to the all books. We can just add a new book as well. You can just edit that books, like now you can see you have this atomic habits. You can just edit this book, and then you can just edit the price of the book as well. So once you will just increase the price, you can have the 500, and then you can just click on the submit, and then you can see once you will again move on to the all books, so the price would be equals to the $500, and then you can also delete that book as well. So to delete, we have the nice effect on the deletes as well. So if you will just click on the delete, and then you can see a notification will be there as the successfully deleted, and after that, after 3 seconds, the request will be sent to the backend, and that product will be deleted as well. And then you can also make that book a featured book as well. So if you will just click on this edit, and if you will just click on the featured, click on the submit, and then you can see that book will then be rendered onto the home page of the application, which is the featured section. So everything in our application is perfectly fine. So this is a final overview of this application as well. So now let's build this application. So please like the video, and please subscribe to the channel as well, so I should be motivated to post the videos like this. So now let's start with the introduction section of what we are doing inside this project. So let's start. So now let's start. So what is the Next.js? So the Next.js is a React framework for the production. So it is a framework which is built on the React to enhance the features and enable the production ready state for the React applications. But what does that mean? So the Next.js is a framework which is built with the Next.js to enhance the features of the standalone React application. So it enhances the capability of the React apps, along with adding some features like adding the server-side code inside the same application. So we don't need to create a separate application for the server-side code. And the content of the application is now pre-rendered into the web page, into the source file of the HTML, as we saw in the demo. So all of the data is now pre-rendered into the HTML. So that would be good for the SEOs, because in the React, first we render an empty page, then we fetch the data, then we render it onto the screen. So that SEO part is skipped inside the React. So now the Next.js has improved that part. So now we have the improved SEOs with pre-rendering and having the file-based routing as well. So we have the file-based routing internally, instead of adding the components, adding their paths, and then rendering their elements into the components and all. So we just have the file-based routing, and that's very good for the Next.js. And all of the Next.js code is just a React code inside the backend, inside the front end, and in the backend we can create the API with the normal Node.js code, which doesn't get exposed onto the front end. So the API code, we create the API inside the API folder. So the code inside the API folder doesn't get exposed onto the front end. Instead, it runs on the node environment. So these are the great features of the Next.js. So now we will see the features of the Next.js as well. So the first feature that we have is the file-based routing. So what does that mean? So the file-based routing works with the file structure and not on the route paths as in the React. So in the React, we had to create the route paths inside that. So it works as per in the HTML. So we make pages and it automatically becomes a route page. So it is the same as the HTML routing instead of creating the path structures and the elements for multiple components, and that would be very bad approach if we are creating the enterprise level application. So we are using the file based approach inside that. After that, we have the second feature of the Next.js, which is a major feature, which has the pre-rendering and the data fetching. The page on the web page is first generated and then renders into the web page instead of fetching and rendering after the first and empty render. So here we have some functions like the get static props, get static paths, and the get server side props, in which we can first fetch the data, and the code inside these functions doesn't run onto the front end. It runs on the node environment, which is the back end of our application. So first we can fetch their data and then give that data to the component to render on the web page. So it gives you an ability to add the data into the source page of the application as well, to perform better into the SEOs of the application. And the next feature that we have is the API routing. But what does that mean? So the Next.js enhance the capabilities of the normal React application, where we can write APIs into the same application without being dependent on any different application like Node.js or any Java application as well. So we don't need a separate application like Node.js app for creating the API, and we can also call the internal API inside the same application as well. And APIs also run on the same server but not into the client side. It runs into the server side code inside the backend of the application inside the node environment. So these are the major top 3 features of the Next.js that we will use inside this application as well. So now we will see the approaches of how we will create the application. So first we will use the MongoDB as the database to store all of the books inside the application. But what is the MongoDB? So the MongoDB is a NoSQL database which stores documents in the form of collections instead of records and tables as in the SQL database. So if you are coming from the SQL backend, so the MongoDB stores the documents in the collection instead of the records in tables as in the SQL database. So the MongoDB is like a NoSQL database where we use the collections instead of the tables. So collection is just a collection of documents, or you can say the collection of records, and each document is based on the JSON or BSON format as well. And now we will use the Node.js. But what is the Node.js? So we all know that the Node.js was a JavaScript engine which was originally built for the browser, and now it can work without a browser as well, and having some extra APIs which we use inside the node environment inside our systems as well. And it allows us to run the JavaScript code outside our browser. So the Node.js was taken out from the Chrome's V8 engine to extend the capabilities of the JavaScript to make it work on outside of the browsers as well. And here in the Node.js, there is a node environment where the server-side code is executed with the JavaScript. So this is the Node.js that we can use, and then we can see the parts of the application as well. So the first will be, we will create the API routes, where we will create the API path routes with the Node.js, and we will create the API with the Node.js, and we will make a models of the book and the controller functions to control the operations on the specific routes of the API. It is based on the MVC approach, on the MVC pattern, and then we will use the Mongoose for the object modeling inside the MongoDB as well. And then we will make a API, and then we will just call the API from the front end of our application. The front end of the application will be built in Next.js pre-rendering logic, and in the front end we will make the view part where we will use the static side generation, the incremental static generation, and then the server side rendering techniques for pre-rendering the data inside the application as well. And we will also use the XCOs to fetch the client side data as well if we need inside our application. And the UI part will be done by the React and the Material UI. And the Material UI is just a UI component library for creating the modern UI UX applications with the React.js. So this is all about this application. So please like the video and please subscribe to the channel as well, so I should be motivated to post the videos and the projects like this. So let's start building this application. So I've opened the folder in the VS Code, and now we need to create a brand new Next.js application directly from the scratch. So the command to create the Next.js application would be npx. It would be the create-next-app, and then the name of the application, like in this case it can be the my app as well. So now let's hit enter, and the new Next.js app will be then installed within very few moments. So let's wait till it completes the installation of the new Next.js application. So the Next.js application is now installed, and now you can see now we have the bookstore, and in that now we have the my app as well. And now you can see now we have the node modules for the packages, and then we have the pages folder for the routing inside that, and we have the API folder for the API calls inside their application. And after that we have the public folder which contains the fav icon of the Vercel, and it contains the SVG icon of the Vercel as well. And then there is a folder of the styles where we have some global stylings of the CSS, and then we have some specific modules styles, like we have the home.modules or CSS, so it will work only on the home files. And then we have the eslint.files, and then we have the eslint files, and then we have the gitignore file for the GitHub, and then we have the config files of the Next.js for some initial configurations inside the Next.js. And after that we have the package.json, which contains all of the information about our application, like we have the name of the my app, we have the version of the 0.1.0, and then this is a private app as well, so we have the private equals to the true. And then we have some scripts like development build. If we want to start a development build, so we have to add here the next dev, and then we have the build, we have the next build, and then we have the start for the next start, and then we have the lint file as well for the next lint. And then we have some dependencies, like we have the dependencies version of the next, so the Next.js version is the 12.1.6, and then we have the React version of the 18.2.0, and then we have the React DOM version of the 18.2.0 as well. And then we have some development dependencies which will work only on the development, but it will not be included in the final bundle, so these are just for the development purposes. And then we have the readme file for the GitHub. So this is all about the folder structure inside the Next.js. And now what we need to do is now we need to create the API for our application. So the application which we are building is the bookstore application. So in the bookstore application, first we need to build the API. The bookstore application will contain some routes. So we want to get all of the books, and then we want to add a book to the database, and then we want to update a book, and then we want to delete a book as well. So there are 4 routes. So we need to create the API which will handle all 4 routes. So now let's start building that application. And now we want to build an API first, so we need to move on to the API folder, and inside that we have the hello.js file. But what this file is doing, so we have a default exported function which is a handler. So this function will be called whenever we make a request to the API/hello. So this function handles all the incoming requests we make to the API/hello, and this function contains a request and the response. So it will get a request from the front end. So whenever we will call this API, so we will send a request from the front end to the back end, and the request object will contain all of the things, like it can have a method of the request what we are sending, like a get or a post, and then it can contain some headers of the request, and it can contain so many things like the data as well. So this request object contains so many things about the request that we are making from the front end. And then we have the response parameter as well. So the response, we want to send back the response to the front end. So we get a request from the front end, and then we want to send some response to the front end as well. So in this case, we are now sending the response which have the status of the server, which is the 200, which is okay. And then we are sending a JSON message which contains the name, and we are statically sending the name as the John Doe. So this is what this API is doing. So now we need to build that API as well for our application. So our API will contains 4 methods. So it can contain the read operation, it needs a add operation, it needs a update operation, and it needs a delete operation as well. So now let's start building that application. So now let's start building that API. So now we need to remove this hello.js because we don't need this file. So I will remove this out. And now inside this API, now we need to create a one more file. It can be the books. So now once we will call an API, so we need to call an API from localhost 3000/API/books. Then only this file will be then called. And now we need to again export a default function. It can be again the handler function, so we can have a function as the handler. And inside that handler function, we again need a request and the response, and the request what we will get from the front end, and response which we need to send. So we can send any response what we want, but now we need to send the data as well. So for now we need to add the database as well inside the application before creating the logic of the API. So for that, now we need to move on to the MongoDB. So we can just move on to the Chrome, and then we can just move on to the mongodb.com to set up the database first. And now you can see now we have the options of the sign in. So we can just click on the sign in. And after that, there would be 2 options of the login. So we can log in with the Google, and then we can also log in with the GitHub as well. So we can log in with the Google as of now. and now the login is successful. And now we need to move on to this drop down, and then we need to click on create new project with that. So we have the new project button, so we need to click on that, and then it will just move on to the page where we can just create a brand new project for our application, and it can be a new project database. And here you can see we can just name our project as well, so we can just name as the book store with next, and after that we can just click on the next button to proceed. And then you can see we have some members and the set permissions, so we can just skip that, and then we can just click on the create project button with that. So it will just create a brand new MongoDB project for us inside the MongoDB cloud. So we don't need to install anything as well inside our system, so we just need to just connect the MongoDB database in the cloud, and then we can just perform all of the operations with that. So now you can see now we have an option of the build a database, so we can just click on that button, and then it will just allow you. And now you can see now we have three options. We have the serverless, so if you want to move on to the serverless, and it is a paid version, so you can just move on with the serverless cloud. And then if you want to move with a dedicated cloud server, so you can just move on with the dedicated. But now if you want to test the application and you want to just have a shared cluster, so we can just click on the shared cluster, and this is a free version which don't require any credit card or anything, so it's a fully free version. So we can just click on the create, so it will just create a shared cluster, and then we can just click on the create cluster button. And now we have the default settings, and then we can just create, and then we can just click on the create cluster button. And now inside the security, now we can just provide some name, so we can just have here the admin. We have to provide the user of the database, so we have the admin. And then in the password we can just click on the auto generate secure password, and then we can just copy that password, and make sure you save that password as well. So I'm now saving this password here, and after that we can just click on the create user button, so it will just create a new user for our application. And after that you have another option as well, so where would you like to connect from, so we can just skip that out because we need to move on to the network access. And then we have an option there to add an IP address, and with that we can just set allow access from anywhere. So if you want your database to be accessed only with your current IP address, so you can just click on that button. But I will now click on the allow access from anywhere because I want to allow that access from anywhere as well. So I can now click on the confirm. So now we can just access our database from any IP address, and now we can just move on to the database. And after that now our database will be then deployed within 1 to 3 minutes. Until then we can just move on to the application, and then we need to install one package to connect with the MongoDB database. So for that we need to install a package. It would be the mongoose, so we have npm install, it is a mongoose. So the mongoose is used to perform the operations with the MongoDB. So now the database is now deployed, and now we can just move on to our function which has a handler function. And now the first thing which we want to do is we want to connect to the MongoDB cloud database. So for that we want to import something from the mongoose, so we need to import the mongoose first. So import mongoose from the mongoose. So now we have a function in the mongoose for the connect, so we have the mongoose dot connect. So in the connect we need to pass here the URL. So for the URL, so now we need to click on the connect button inside the database deployments, and then we have the option of connect your application with the MongoDB native drivers. And after that we can just copy this URL code from there. So this is the URL which we need to connect to the MongoDB database, so we can just copy that, and then we can just move on to the mongoose.connect, and then we need to paste this code here. So now we have this URL here, and now instead of this password we want to add the password that we have just copied while generating the secure password. So this is the password which I have copied, so we can just copy this, and then we can just paste this after the admin colon. And now the mongoose.connect returns a promise, so we can just have here the then statement after that. So the then after that we have a console.log that the connected. So now we have the console.log. So what this function is doing, so we have the mongoose.connect, so it will just connect our application to the MongoDB database, and after that it returns a promise. So we have a then statement with the console.log connected, and after that we will have a catch statement as well. So if there is an error, so we will just console.log the error as well. So if there is an error, so we will just console.log the error. So if we now save, if we now move on to the application, if we now just start the application again, npm run dev, so it will just start a local development server on the localhost port of the 3000. So now the application is now compiled, and now we can just move on to the browser, and then we can just call the API from that browser only. So for that we can move on to browser, and after that we can just create a new tab, and then we can just have a localhost 3000/API/books. And now you can see after requesting that page, if we now move on to the application, and now you can see now we have the console.log of the connected. So now our application is now connected to the MongoDB database. So that's a big step. So now we can just move on, and then we can just define this code inside a different function. So we can just create a folder as the API helpers, and inside that we can just handle all of the API requests which we want to create here. So for that we can just move on to the my app directory, which is the root directory of the application, and then we can just define here a folder with the API/helper. And after that, inside the helper functions, now we can just define here the utils file. So we have a utils.js, and inside that utils.js, now we can just define the function to connect to the MongoDB database. So we have a const connect to database, and it is a async function. So we have a async, and after that we can just paste the code here. So we have the mongoose.connect, and we have this call here, and then this is a async. So we can just add here the await as well, because it's a asynchronous task. And after that, this code will just connect our application to the MongoDB database. And now we can just move on to the books, and inside that now we can just call that function as well. So for that we need to export this function as well. So we have the export const as the connect to database, and now we will just call this function here inside this handler function. So we have a connect to database. So it will just connect our application to the database, and then this handler function can also be an asynchronous function as well. So we need to add the async before the function, and after that we can just await for this task as well. So now if we now just restart the application, npm run dev. So now if we now just move on to the application, if we now just request API/books, if we now just hit enter, and then you will see now you have the message of the connected as well. So now our application is now connected to the database, and now the first thing what we want to do is we want to get the model of the books. So now we are creating a bookstore application. So first we need to create the model of the book, and then we need to create the controller functions which control the API routing inside that. So for the model, in the API helpers, again we can just define a folder. It can be a model. So inside that folder model, we can just create the schema of the book which contains the model of the book. So we can have a book.js. So now inside that file, now we can just create the model of the book. So for that, now we need to create this schema. So we need to define here the schema, and the schema is like a thing which contains all of the information about that specific item. Like a human can have the eyes, can have the hands, can have so many things, but each human contains that schema only. So for that we can just define the schema. So we can just have here the const schema, and then we need to import the mongoose.schema class. So we have a schema class inside the mongoose, so we can just define the schema with that. And now we need to create the book schema. So we can just create a variable as the book schema, and it will be equals to a new schema that we have just created the reference of the mongoose.schema. And inside that, now we need to create the properties which every document will contain. Like it contain the title of the book. So the title will contain an object, and after that it will contain the type. So we need to define the type of the title. So the type of the title will be in the string format. So we need to define the type as the string. And after that we need to add the required field. So if we specify the required fields inside that, so this field would be then required, and if we don't provide that field, so the database will throw an error. So we can have a required as the true. So now this field needs to have a data every time. So now we can just copy that title field as well. And after that we can have there the author. So we can just change the title to the author. So now we have two fields inside our schema. So we have the title and the author, and now we can just have a one more field, and it can be the price of that book. So we can just have a price. After the price will contain the type of the number and not the string. So we have the type of the number, and the required is equals to the true. And after that we can have an image URL of the book as well. So we have again the image URL, and in the image URL the type would be the string. So we can have a type as the string. And after that we can have here the featured. So the featured will have a type of the boolean, and then the required field will not be true, because sometimes we don't need to store the feature inside that. So now the book contains the title, it contains the author, it contains the price, and it contains the image URL and the featured. So this is the schema of the book that we wanted inside our application. And now we can just move on, and then we can just export the schema as well. So we need to create the model. So we have export default, it will be the mongoose dot model. So we need to create the model of the mongoose, and now we need to define the model. So the model can be the book, and after that we need to define the schema of the model as well. So it can be the book schema that we have just created. So now in the MongoDB database, the collection will be stored as the books. So we have the default naming convention inside the MongoDB database. So the book will be generated at the books because it converts the singular form into the plural form, and the first letter will be then uncapitalized. So it will be in the smaller case format. So this will be the collection inside the MongoDB database. So now we can just move on, and then we can just define some helper function to get all of the books from the database. So for that we can just move on, and then we can just define a new controller functions here. So we can have a controller folder. So now inside the controllers, now we can just define some functions. So we can have the books controller .js, and now inside the books controller.js, now we need to control all of the routing functions inside this books controller. So we can just have a first function, and it can be get all books. So now this function will be then called in the get all books. So it will be an asynchronous function again. So the async, and then it will contain the request and the response as the parameters as well. And after that we need to just export this function as well, because we need to just call this function inside the books.js file. And after that we can just move on, and then we can just have the all of the books inside this function. So for that we can just define the let books, and in the let books, now we need to add the try catch block. So we have the try catch block because this is a database operation and it can fail as well. So we can have the try catch block. So in the try, we can have here the books will be equals to the book model. So we need to import the model first of the book. So it will just refer to the collection of the books. So now book dot, we have a method of the find. So it will find all of the books inside the database. So we need to specify here the query. So if we specify any query, so it will find only that books which matches the query. But if we don't specify any query, so it will match all of the records, and it will just give you the collection of all of the books with that. So now we can just have here the book.find, and this is a database operation, and it is an asynchronous task. So we should add here the await as well, because we need to wait for this task to complete. And after that we can just have here the catch block. So in the catch block, if we get an error, so we will just return the console.log the error, or we can just return the new error as well. So we have the new error, and inside the new error we will just have here the message of the error. So now this is the code for the get all books, and now we can add some validations as well. So if we don't have the books, so we can just have some validations. So we can just return the response dot status would be equals to the 500 as the no books found, or there is an error finding the books. And after that we can have a JSON message, and inside that JSON message we can have a message, and the message will contain like internal server error. So now we are sending a status of the 500, and then we are sending a message as the internal server error. And now we can just check one more validation, like if the books dot length, so books have the array. So if the array dot length equals to the 0, like if we don't have any books, so we can just return again the response dot status would be equals to the 404 as the no book found. And then we can just have here the JSON message, again the message, and the message will contain as the no books found. So this is the API which we want to build. And after that, if we pass all of these validation checks, now we need to just return the books. So we need to respond the response dot status would be equals to the 200, which is okay. After that we can just send here the JSON message, and after that we need to send here the books. And now we can just send here the books / books as well, but as defined in the ES6. So we can just send here only the books, and it will be treated as the books colon books. So we can just only send the books. So now we have just created one controller function for the getting all of the books from the database. So now we can just move on to the books.js, and inside that, once we are just connecting to the database, and after that we can just have here a check. So if the check will be if the request dot method would be equals to the get. So if we are sending a get request, then we need to call that function which we have just created as the get all books. So we can have a get all books with that. So this is the request which we want to make. If we now just move on, So now we have created a request for the get all books. So for that, now we need to test the API as well. So for testing the API, now we need to install one thing. So we need to install the Postman. So we can just search for the Postman on the Google, and now you can see we have the Postman API platform. So we can just test our API with the Postman. So we can just send any type of request with the data, with the headers, and with the so many things. So you can just download the Postman by clicking on the specific OS. So if you are running on the Windows, so you can just select the Windows. If you are on the Mac, so you can just select on the Mac. And if you are on the Linux, so you can just download it for the Linux. So it is available for all three operating systems. So we can just select here the Windows, and then we will just install the Postman. And the steps to install the Postman is very simple. So you just need to click next, next, next. So it will be just installed. So I've already installed the Postman, so I don't need to install it again. So I will skip that. And after that, now we can just move on to the Postman. So this is the screen of the Postman, and now we need to just click on this plus icon. So it will just create a tab, and now we need to just enter the URL of a server here. And now our application is being run on the localhost at the 3000/API/books. So we need to specify the URL. So it can be the HTTP localhost. It would be the 3000/API/books. So if we now just click on the send request and make sure the method is equals to the get, so you can just select any method there as well. So the method is equals to the get, and then we are sending a localhost 3000/API/books. If we now just click on the send, and now I think we got an error inside that, so we can just check that error as well. So now we have the response.status as the 404. We have just forgot to define there the response and the request here. So we need to add here the request and the response, because we are calling that get all books. So we need to send the response as well. And after that, we can just cancel that request, and then we can just check if the application is now compiled. And now we can just move on again, and then we can just click on the send. And now I think the request should be okay. And now I think we got an error, that the overwrite model error. So we have the error of the cannot overwrite the book model once compiled. So for solving this error, we need to move on to the model of the book. So we have the model of the book.js, and after that, now once we are just generating the mongoose.model, so we need to add here some validation, like if we can just check if the model is already there, then we don't need to perform this code. So for that, we can have a mongoose dot, we have the models. So we have the array of the models, and then we can just check if we have the models.book already there. So then we don't need to perform this step. So if we now just save, if we now just restart the application with the npm run dev, and if we now just move on to the Postman, if we now just click on the send, I think now everything should be okay. And now you can see, now we got the message as the no books found, because now we don't have any books inside the database. So now everything is working perfectly fine, and now we got a message as the API resolved. So we can just move on again to the books.js, and then we can just return as well. So we forgot to return this as well. So now we are now just returning the get all books, and in the get all books, we are now returning all of the responses that we want to generate. So if we will just click on the send request again, and then you will see we have the connected, and then you will see we have the message of the no books found, and now we didn't get this error. So everything is working perfectly fine now. And then we can just add one more validation inside this utils.js once we are connected to the MongoDB database. So we can just have here the if check, like if we have the mongoose dot connection, so we have the 0 connections. So if we have the connections of the 0 index active, so we don't need to connect that. So we will just return, and we don't connect to the database. So we already connected that database, so we don't need to just add here the connection, because the connections work inside the array. So if we already have the connection, then we don't need to perform this await mongoose code. So now we can just move on to the application. We can just click again on the send. So everything is working perfectly fine, and now the get request is complete, and now we don't have any books inside the database. So we are getting as the message of the no books found. And now what we can do to post a book to the database, so we can just create a new post request in which we can just post a book to the database as well. So for that, we can just move on to the books controller, and then we can just create a one more function with the post book to the database. So for that, we can just create a one more function, it would be the export, it would be the const, it would be the add book, and it would be a function. And after that, this function would be asynchronous function, so we can have a async here as well. And after that, this function will contain the request and the response. And after that, we can just move on, and then we can just get some data from the body. So if we are sending a book to the database, if we are just sending a request to the database with the post request, so we send some data. So where the data is being sent, so the data is being sent to the request.body. So the body contains the data in which we send the request to the backend. So all of the things would be now added inside the request.body. So we can just destructure all of the things which will be now sent to the backend. So we can just have the const. We can now destructure all of the things from the request.body. So now what we need to send from the front end. So we need to send here the title, we need to send the author, we need to send the price, we need to send the image URL, and then we need to optionally send the featured. So now these are the things which we need to send from the front end to make a post HTTP request. So for that, we can just add here the title. Because we get the title, we will get the author, and then we will get the author, we get the price, we have the image URL. So we can have the price, we can have the image URL, and after that we get the featured product as well. So these are the things which we will then require from the request.body. And after that, we can just add some validations here as well, like if we don't have the title, and if the title dot trim is equals to an empty string, so the trim removes the white space. So if we are just sending a white space from the front end, so we can just check this validation here. And after that, we can just move on, and then we can just check the same for the author. So if we have the author, so if we don't have the author, and after that, if the author dot trim would be equals to an empty string again, and then we can just check the same thing for the price. So if we don't have the price, and after that, we can just check for the image URL. So if the image URL, if we don't have the image URL, and if the image URL dot trim is equals to an empty string, and after that, we can just send the return, the response dot status would be equals to the 422, and the 422 status is like a status which has an unprocessable entity, which is like if we get an invalid inputs from the front end, so we send the 422 response to the front end. After that, we can just send the JSON message as well. So message will contain invalid inputs. So this is the message which we want to send to the front end. So now we are checking the validation if we don't have the title, or so if after removing the white space the title is empty, and then the same for the author, and then the same for the image URL. So now we are sending this validation, and then we are now sending the response.status equals to the 422, and then we have the JSON message of the invalid inputs which we got from the front end. And after that, if we pass this validation check, now we need to create a new book. So now for creating the new book, so we can just have define the let book, and after that we can just have here the try catch block again, because it is a database operation. And after that, now we can just define here the books. So the book would be equals to a new book, and now we need to create the new book document. So we can just have here the object, and in the object it will contain the document. So we will have the title of the document, we will have the name of the document. I think after the title we will have the author of the document, and after the author we will get the price, and after the price we will get the image URL, and after the image URL we will get the featured. So now we have just generated a new book document, and now what we want to do is we want to save that book as well. So for saving that book, now we have the book will be equals to, we have the save function from the book. So now the book dot save, so we have a save function inside the Mongoose to save the document to the collection. So inside that, now we have the book dot save, and this is an asynchronous task, so we have a await here as well. So now this book dot save function will save a record inside the database for that. And now we can just have here the catch block as well. So if we get an error, so we will just return, we will just new error, and the error will contain the new error that we just got. So this is the code for it. So we have the book, and then we have the new book, and after that we are now saving the book to the database as well, and then we are just having the new error if we got an error. And now we can just check one more validation. So if the book didn't save, or if it a falsy value, so we can just return the response dot status would be equals to the 500, and after that we can have here the message of the JSON, like it can be the message. The message will be equals to like invalid, or it can be the internal server error. So now we have this validation, and after that, if all of the checks are now clear, so we can just return the response dot status would be equals to the 201, which is created. So if anything is created to the database, so we send a response dot status of the 201. After that we can have a JSON message again, and the JSON message will contain a brand new book that we have just created. So we can have a brand new book after the book has been created. So now we have just created this function for the add book. So what we are doing is, now first we are getting all of the things from the request.body. So we get all of the things from there, like the title, author, price, image URL, and the featured check. And then we are now just checking some validations here, and then we are just defining a new book, and then we are just having the try catch block, and then we are saving that book to the database. And after that we have some validations, and after all that, if all of the checks are now clear, and then we are sending a response.status as the 201, which is created, and then we are sending a JSON message as the book. So now we need to call this function inside the books, and inside that now we can just declare a else if block, and inside the else if we can just check if the request.method is equals to the post. So if we are sending a post HTTP request, then we need to call this function. So we have a return, it would be this function that we have just created as the add book. So we can have there the add book, and inside that add book now we need to send the request and the response as we are now receiving inside the handler function. So now we have just declared this function. So now we can just save, and if we now move on to the postman, if we now just send a new request to the backend, so now we can just create a one more tab, and then we can just copy that URL here as well. We can just copy this URL, and then we can just paste this URL here, and after that we can just move on to the body. We can select a raw from there, and then we can just select the JSON, because now we are sending a JSON data, and inside that JSON data there will be a fields, like there will be title. So the title will be like my new book, and then there will be author of the book, so it can be the author. Every the author we can just define the author as the James, and after that we can just have the price of the book. So the price is the numeric value, so we can have a price of the 400. And after that we can just have here the image URL of the book. So we have the image URL, and we can just define an empty image URL for now here. So we can just have here the empty, or we can just have here the sample, and after that we can just move on, and then we can just define a featured. So the featured will be equals to the false for now. So if we now just click on the send request, and now we need to just change the method of the request as well. So the method would be equals to the post, and now we have the same URL for this request. And after that, what we are doing here, we are checking the method request equals to the post, and then we are sending this book from there. And if we now just click on the send, then the book should be created, and now you can see now we got the status of the 201 which is created. And now what we got the actual book that we have just created. We got the title, we got the author, we got the price, we got the image URL, and then we got the feature. But we got two other values as well, which is coming from the MongoDB. So this is the ID of the book. So this is the ID of the book which is being stored onto the MongoDB database. So now this book is being stored to the MongoDB database as well. So if you're not sure about that, if it is stored or not, so you can just create a get request again. So you can just click on the send again. Now there should be one book, and now you can see now we have the books array, and inside that array now we got the book as well. So now we have just created a book inside the database as well, and now the request is also successful to the backend. And now we can just create one more book, so it can be my second book, and then we have the author equals to the James, so we can just have here the author with the Arthur, and after that we can just have here the price of the 200, and then we have the image URL again, the sample, and the false. So if we now just click on the send again, and now you can see now our second book is also created into the database. So we got the ID as well of that book. And if we now just click on the get request, if we now just click on the send, and now there should be two books here, and now you can see now we got the new book, and then we got the my second book as well inside a database as well. And if you are still not sure that if the book is being stored to the MongoDB database, so you can just move over to the MongoDB database, and then you can just click on the collections tab, and then you will see you have the test.books. So we have the test of the database, and then we have the books collection inside that. And then you can see if you will just click on the books, and now you can see the first book is the my new book, and then the second book is the my second book. So all of the things are now being stored inside the MongoDB database as well. So now we have just completed the get request and the add request to the book as well. And now it's time to create a update request to the book as well. For the update request, we can now move on to the books page. But now for the update request, we need the ID. So we need the ID of the book which we want to update. So for that, we can just create here the dynamic API route as well. So we can also create here the dynamic API route as in the routing inside the Next.js. So it can be the id.js, or we can just define some different folder for that. So we can have a folder of the book, and inside that book we can just have here the dynamic ID file. So it can be the id.js. So now if you want to create an update request or the delete request, so we want to have here the /API/book, that's the ID of the book. This is the route which we need it. After that, we can just have here the export default, and it can handler function, and inside that handler function we can just have here the function, and this would be an async function. After that, in the handler function, it contains the request and the response as well, as we saw in other functions as well. So it will get the request and the response. And after that, now we need to connect to the MongoDB database as well. So we can just have here the connect to database function from there, and this is a async, so we can just have here the await as well. So it would be the connect to database. After that, we can just check the request.method again. So if the request.method is equals to the put, so if we send a put request, then we need to perform different step, or else we can just have here else if the request.method, and if the request.method will be equals to the delete, then we need to send different requests. So for the put request, then we can just move on to the books controller, and then we can just create a one more function for the update request. So for that, we can just have here the const at the update book. So it will be equals to again the request and the response, and after that it will be an asynchronous function again. So we add there the async, and after that we can just have this function here. And now what we want to do is, now first we need the ID of the book which was rendered. So how can we get the ID of that book? So for that, we can just move on, and then we can just get the ID from the request object, because as we have discussed earlier, the request object has all of the properties and all of the things which we provide. So we will provide here the ID inside the request query object. So for that, we can just get the query and the ID of that query as well. So for the ID, we can just get the ID here, and the ID will be equals to the request.query.id, and make sure we have the ID and the ID same. So if you have here the book ID instead of this just ID, so you need to add here the book ID, because this is a dynamic page and it doesn't know about that. So the name of that route and this ID should be the same, and after that we will just get the ID. So we can just console.log the ID as well if we get the ID. So we can just have the ID. And now what we want to do, now we got the ID, and now again we want to get these things from the request.body. So we can just grab all of these things from there. So we can just grab that, and then we can just paste that here as well, because the code should be the same. And now we are getting the title, author, price, image URL, and the featured, and then we need to add the validations as well. So now after that, if the validation checks has been passed, so now we can just create a one more book. So let book will be equals to undefined value, and then we can just have the try catch block again after that. So we can have a try, and inside that try, now the book will be equals to the book dot, now we have a function of the model. So we have the function as the find by ID and update. So this function will grab that book from that ID. So we need to pass here the ID. So we are now getting the ID from that request.query.id. So we get the ID, and after that we need to send here that object which we want to update. So we send here the JSON object, and inside that JSON send all of the things which we want to update. So we need to update the title of the book, we need to update the author of the book, we need to update the price of the book, we need to update the image URL of the book, and after that we need to update the feature as well. So now what we are doing here is, now we are now getting the book dot find by ID and update. So we have a function in the book model dot find by ID and update. So it will just find a document by its ID, and it will just update the document with the given values. And this is an asynchronous task, so we should add the await as well. So now we can just save, and now we can just have here the catch block as well. So we have here the catch, error. So if we get an error, so we will just return, so we will just log this error as well. And after that, the book is equals to the book find by id and update. So we don't need to call here the book.save, because this function will automatically save the document as well. And after that, we can just check if the book saved or not. So we can just check if the book is a falsy value, then we can say return the response.status would be equals to the 500 as the internal server error. So we get the JSON as well as the message of the internal server error. And after that, we can just move on, and then we can just define here the return as a response.status would be equals to the 200, which is successful. And then we can just send here the JSON message again. So we get the JSON message, and the JSON message will contain like a message again, like the successfully updated. So if we now save, and if we now move on to the books file, and now we need to just export this function as well. So to export, and then now we need to move on to the dynamic ID page of the API, and now we need to call this function here. So if the request.method is equals to the put, now we need to call this function. So when to return, it would be the update book. And now we can just pass the same request and the same response that we receive inside this handler function. So if we now just save, if we now just move on to the Postman, we can just create one more tab, and then the URL should be almost same. So we can just grab that URL, and then the URL would be this time the API/book/the ID of that book. So now we have just created the my second book. So if we want to just update this book, so we can just grab this ID, and then we can just add this ID after the book. So now we have just added this ID API/book that ID, because we have just declared the pages at the API, book, and the ID of the book. So after that, this will be a put request. So we need to add the put, and then we need to send again the body as the raw JSON file. So we need to select the JSON from there. After that, we can just copy that thing from there, like we have just defined here some things. We can just copy that body, and then we can just paste that body here. And after that, the title would be my second book. So we can just change the title like my third book. And after that, the author should be the same, the price should be equals to the 300, and we have the image URL as the sample, and then we have the featured equals to the false. So now we have just defined everything. So if we now just click on the send, so everything should work fine. And now you can see, now we got the message as well as the successfully updated. So now our book is also updated. So if we now just get all of the books, should be the my third book, and now you can see we have the my third book, and now you can see the price of the book is also updated. So everything is working perfectly fine. And now we have just created the request functions for the get request, and we have done the post request, and then we have also generated the update book request. And now the only thing which is remaining is the delete request. So what we can do for the delete is we can again move on to the books controller, and then we can just define one more function. It will be the export const, it will be delete book. So delete book again will be an asynchronous function, and after that it will contain again the request and the response in the function. And after that, now again we want to get the ID of the books, so we get the ID from there. So we get this ID, and after grabbing the ID, now we can just have here the let book, and then it will be undefined. And after that, we can just have here the try catch block. And now in this function, now we don't need to get any data from the request.body. We only required it inside the add and the update. And now inside the delete, we only require the ID of that book, and now we can just delete that book. So in the delete, we can just have here the book will be equals to again the await, and again we have the function inside the mongoose to delete the product. So we can just have here the book model dot find by ID, and then we have the function of the find by ID and remove. So we can just use that function. And after that, we need to just pass here the ID of that book. So we can just pass here the ID. So it will just automatically detect that book, and it will just delete that book from the database. And after that, we can just have here the catch block again. So if we get an error, so we will just return the new error, which will contain the error as the message. So now what we are doing here is, now we are now defining here the book, and after that we can just have here the validations as well. So if the book is a falsy value, and if it is not updated, so we can return the response.status would be equals to the 500 as the internal server error. and then we can just send here the JSON message again, as the message would be equals to enable to delete. And after that, if everything is okay, then we can just check. And after that, if everything is okay, then we can just return the response dot status would be equals to, and it would be the 200. And after that, we can just send here the JSON message again as the message, and the message will be equals to the successfully and deleted. So this is the request for the delete book. So what we are doing here is now we are now getting the ID from the request.query.id, and then we are just generating the book, and then we have the function of the find by ID and remove, which will just remove the book from that given ID. After that, we are now catching if there is an error, and then we have some validation. If the book is a falsy value, then we are sending a status of the 500, and then if everything is okay, then we are sending a status of 200 and the message of the successfully deleted. And now we need to remove on to the dynamic ID page, and after that, if we have the request.method is equals to the delete, now we need to return that function that we have just created. So it will be delete book. So now we need to call this function here. So we need to pass here the request and the response here. So if we now save, so everything should work perfectly fine. If we now move on to the postman, and now you can see now we have get request, we have the post, we have the put, and then we can also create a delete request. So the URL should be the same from the put, so we can just get that URL, and after that we can just have here the request as a delete. And now we need to remove this book from there. So we have a my third book, and now if you want to delete this book from there, so we need to grab this ID again. So we can just copy that ID, and then we can just paste this ID here. And after that, if we now just click on the send request, so everything should work perfectly fine. And now you can see now we got the message as the successfully deleted. And now if we now just move on to the get request, if we now just send the request, and now you can see now we didn't see the my third book as well. So now all of the operations are now working fine, and now we have just completed the CRUD operation with the API with the Next.js. So this is how we can create the API inside the Next.js. So this was a simple API in which we had the read operation, we have the write operation, we have the update operation, and then we have the delete operation. So now we have just completed the API inside our application. So we have created the API, but we have missed one thing. So we need to create a one more request in which we can get a book from the ID. If we want to get a book from this ID, so we don't have any route as of now, so we don't have any controller as of now. So we want to create a controller function in which we can just get a new book from the ID as well. So for that, we can just move on to the ID page, and there, as we are checking else if the method equals to the delete or the put, we can just write one more else if case, and we can check if the request dot method is equals to the get, then we can just return a new controller function. So for that, we can again move on to the books controller, and here we can just create one more function. It could be the const, it can be the get book from the ID, and it would be an async function again. And after that, it will get the request and the response in the parameters as well. And then first thing we want to do is we want to get the book from this ID. So we want to get the ID. So for that, we can just get the ID, as we get the ID inside the delete and the update operations as well. So it would be the ID equals to the request dot query dot ID. So now we got the ID, and now we can just define the book, let book, and after that we can just write the try catch block again to add this inside the try catch block, because it's a database operation and it can fail as well. So the book would be equals to, it can be the await because it is an asynchronous operation, so we need to wait for this code, so it can be the book. And then we have the find by ID function inside the Mongoose. So in the Mongo schema, we have the function of the find by ID in which it returns a document by the given ID. So it runs a query, and then we add the ID inside the argument, and after that it runs a query and it returns a document with that ID. And after that, we can just add here the catch block as well. So if we got an error, so we will just return, it will be the new error, and the error can be the error that we got. And after that, we can just add a validation logic as well. So if we don't have the book, then we can just return a new response, can be the response dot status, and it can be the 404 as the no book found. And then we can add a JSON message, so it contain a message as the parameters, and after that there will be the no book found, so it can be no book found from the given ID. And after that, if we passed all of the validation checks, then we can just return the response.status, and it can be the 200, which is okay. And then we can just again send a JSON, and the JSON will be only the book which we want to send. So now we have created this function as the get book from ID, in which we are getting the ID, then we are getting the book, then we are adding validation, and then we are returning the book which we got from the ID. And now we can just move on to the id.js page, and then we can just return this function. So it can be the get book from the ID. So we can just add the get book from ID, and then we can just pass the request and the response in the parameters. And after that, if we can save, if we now move on to the application again, so now we can just move on to the postman, and then we can just add here the request. So first we will just post a new book from there. So we can just move on to the body, and then now I have added this image URL inside that. So we can just click on the send, and here the new book is created. And now we can just get this ID of that book, and then we can just move on, and then we can just move on to the new get request, and then we can just write the URL here as the HTTP. It can be localhost, can be the 3000 /API/books/ID of that book. And after that we can just add here the ID. So we have just copied this ID from there, and it should be the book, not the books. So if we now just click on the send, now we should get the book. So now you can see, now we got the book that we have just created. So this is the ID that we've got. So that's all for the requests. And as per the validation, so if we now change anything inside the request, like there's a 7, if we now change it to the 6 or anything, so if we now just click on the send, and then you will see, then we will get a message as the no book found from the given ID. So this is all about the API that we are building. So now we have just created the API, and now we can just successfully move on to the front end, because now we have completed the API. And in the front end we can just move on to the index.js, and there you can see we are now rendering home. So if we now just move on to the localhost at the rate 3000, and now you can see you will get the home inside your web page as well. So the API is fully complete, and now the next target is, now we need to just work on the front end of our application. So before moving ahead to the front end, I have added some books into the database so that we can work on the front end. So we have added 6 books inside that. So you can also add some books, because we need that books to render it onto the front end. So you can just follow the same approach as we have done inside the postman. So you can just send some post request for the new books, and then the new book should appear. And make sure you are sending the actual image URL, and you can get any image URL from any server like the Amazon or Google. So you can add some books from there. So let's start with the front end. And here now we are into the home page, and now we need to render something onto the home page. So on the home page we need to render the featured books inside that. So for the featured books, as we have created the featured key inside the schema, so we need to render the featured books onto the home page of our application. And then we will just create a books page, and then we will render all of the books inside the books page. But for the index.js, we only need to render the featured books. So for that we can just generate the folder structure first. So now inside the pages we can just create a new folder, and it can be the books. And inside the books, now we can just create the index.js page. So it can be the index.js, and in the index.js we will just have only the function. So it can be the function as the books home. And after that we can just export this function as well. So we can have export default as the book home. And after that we can just return something here as of now. So we can just return here the h1 tag, can be the books page. And after this, now we can just move on, and then we can just generate a dynamic ID page for the books to get a book from the ID inside the URL. So we can have id.js, and in the id.js again we can have a function, and it can be the book detail, because in this page first we will get the book, and then we will just update this book as well. So we can just return, and it can be the h1 again, can be the book detail. After that we can just export default as the books detail again. So it can be the books details. So now we have created the folder structure, and the next thing that we want to do is we want to fetch the featured books onto the index.js page, which is the home page of our application. So we need to render the featured books into the index.js page. So for that we need to fetch the books, and then we need to just filter the featured books from the database. And now how can we do that? So we can just use the use effect as well to fetch the books, but the use effect runs after the component is being rendered. So the books will not be available inside the source page of our application. So there is a second approach which is available inside the Next.js, and we can use the get static props, which is available via the Next.js. And the get static props is the function which runs before the component function runs. And the get static props and the code inside the get static props will not be exposed to the front end as well. So we can write any server side logic there as well, because the get static props runs on the node environment and not onto the client side API, which is the JavaScript. So we can use the get static props. So for that we can just write the export const, it can be the get static props, and it will be an asynchronous function. So we need to add the async, and after that we need to just return their props. So in the get static props we just return some props, and the props will then be available to the component function. So for that now we can just return here some props, but for the props we need to return here the array of the books, which are the featured books, onto the home page of our application. So for that we need to fetch the books. So we can just create new folder inside the API helpers, and it can be the front end, and then we can just call the API from this file only. So we can just create the utils.js, and then we can just write some functions here in which we can just call the API. So this will be a utils.js, and after that we will just call here some functions to get the books, to get the featured books, to get the book from its ID, and so on. So first thing that we want to do is we can just export, it can be the const, and it can be the get all books. So we will just create a function to get all of the books from the database, and after that what we can do is we can just create one more function as the get filtered books, and in the filtered books we will just filter the books from the featured key. So for that first we need to just call here the API. So for calling the API here we need to run there the Axios. So we can also use the fetch, which is globally available by the JavaScript, but the Axios is a preferable approach because it is very easy and simple to use, and it is a promise based HTTP library in which we can just call the API in very simpler way. So we can just install the Axios from the npm install and the Axios. So the Axios will be then installed within very few moments, and after that we can just import the Axios, and then we can just perform the Axios operations like the get, post, delete, or the update. So now we can just restart the application again from the npm run dev. After that we can just import the Axios. So the Axios from the Axios. So the Axios is default exported, so we don't need to add the curly braces. So the Axios is now imported, and now what we can do, so if we call any function from the Axios like the get, post, delete, or the put, so it returns a response. So we need to get the response. So we can just create a variable as the const response, and it will be equals to the await because it is a HTTP task, and it can be the Axios dot get. So we need to get all of the books, so we need to perform the get requests. So we need to call the get function, and in the get then we need to pass the URL. The URL can be HTTP as localhost, the port of the 3000 / API / books. So this is the API / books. So we need to call here the API, and this is the get request, and after that we can just perform any validation, like if the response dot status is not equals to the 200, then what we can do is we can just return the new error or anything like the new error, like it can be the server error, it can be the internal server error. So now if the response is the 200, so now if the response is not equals to the 200, then we are returning the internal server error. So if the response is 200, then we can just extract the data from the response. So to extract the data we can just use the await and the response.data. So the response.data we will get here the data, and now you can see now in the data we are sending here the books. So if we just move on to the API inside the books page, and then as we are sending the get all books, so we can just move on to the get all books, and then you can see we are sending here the JSON as the books. So what we can do is we can just have the response.data, and then we can just add the question mark, which is like the we will receive the data in the future dot books. So we can just add here the const data is equals to the response.data dot books, and after that if we get the data, if we got the response.data, then we will get the response.data dot books, then we will just return here the data. So this is the final approach to get the data, to get all of the books from the database. And now what we can do is we can just create one more function which will just filter the featured books. So for that we can have here the export const, it can be the get featured books, it will be an async function as well. So we need to add here the async, and after that what we can do, first we need to get all of the books. So we can get the books will be equals to the get all books that we have just created. So we need to call the get all books function. So in the get all books, this is a promise, so we need to await for this as well. So we need to add the await. So we can just check here the validation as well. So if the books dot length is equals to the 0, then we need to just return the empty array, because then we need to return here the empty array. After that, if the books dot length is greater than 0, then what we can do is we can just have here the const featured books. So we can just have here the featured books here, but where can we get the featured books? So we will just query over that books. So we have a function inside the array which is a filter, so it runs on a query. So we can just provide some filter. So we can have a books dot filter. So the filter also returns an array. You can see this returns an array of the query. So then we need to add here the callback and in the callback parameter we will get here the book, and the book what query what we need to add here. So now we need to add the query. So we need to add the book dot featured should be the true. So then only we need to just filter all of the books. So what it will do, so it will just get all of the books which has the books dot featured key is equals to the true. So then we will get all of the books, and after that we can just return the books and just return the featured books. So if we now save, and now we need to just move on into the index.js page file. After that, now we can just call here this function. So we can just have a const featured books, or like it can be the const books will be equals to the get featured books, which will be then imported from their API helpers, and make sure you are importing it from the front end. And after that we need to add the await as well, because we need to await for this task as well. And now what we can do is we can just return here some props. So we can just return the props. So we need to return the object as the props, and in the props what we need to return is we need to return here the books. So we can just return only the books inside the props. And now what we can do is we can just move on to the home, and then we can just extract here the books prop from this get static props. And after that what we can do is we can just log here the books. So we can just console.log only the books. So if we now save, so what we are doing here is we are now running the get static props, and then we are declaring the books as the get featured books. So in the get featured books, first we are getting all of the books from this function, and then we are now filtering all of the books which has the featured prop is equals to the true. And then what we are doing here is now we are now returning the props object, and the props object contains the books. So we can write here the books and the books as well, but in the ES6 we don't need to write the books colon books if the name is the same, and here also the name is same, so we don't need to write books colon books. And after that we are now sending the props to the home function, and then we are logging the books. So if we now save, if we now just move on to the application and refresh the page, now you can see now we got the values inside the array. So we have 3 elements inside the array. So first we got the 0, which has the author as the James, the book is the mindset, and the featured is equals to the true. And then second, if you can just click on that, now you can see now we got the title as the quiet, and then you can see we have the James, we have the featured equals to the true, and the third book as well we have the featured prop is equals to the true, and then we have the title of the start with Y. So now we are getting all of the books from the database which have the featured prop, and then we can just get all of the books from the database as well. So if we call the get all books from there, so now we got the books, and now we need to render the books into the front end as well. And now we are able to get the data from the database, and now the next steps is now we need to render this data onto the UI of our screen. Now we need to work on the UI parts. UI part will contain the header of the application which will be available throughout the application, and then we need to render the book list inside that. But how can we do that? So first thing that we have to do is we want to create the header of the application which will also contain the routing operations. So the header will contain 2 routes. The first route will be the home page of our application, in which we can click on the home. Then the home page should be then rendered, and the home page will contain the featured books. And then we want to create one more route inside the header which will be the all books, and in the all books we need to render all of the books whether it's a featured or not. So let's build the header of the application first. So for that now we can just move on to the my app, and then we can just create here a folder as the components, and the components folder, inside the components folder all of the components should be then declared. So now the first component is the header, so we want to build here the header.js. So now we want to build here the header, so we can just write here the RAFCE to add a default setup of the React component, because it will be a regular React component that we want to declare, and it will be a reusable component, so we can reuse it anywhere. And now what we are doing here is now we are now importing the React from the React, and now we are now returning the header, and then we are just exporting as a default export for the header. And now what we can do to build the header, So as we have discussed in the introduction section of the video, so we will use the material UI for the header. So we can just move on to the MUI.com, which is a React UI component library, which is very easy and simple to use. So it is very simple library and it contains some reusable components. Like if you are building the header, it contains the app bar and the toolbar to design the header. So we don't need to work on the designing part or the CSS part. So it has some predefined and pre-styled components that we can use to save our time from designing our application with the normal CSS. So now we can just use the material UI. So now if we can see there is a link of the npm install material UI. So we can just copy that link and then we can just move on to the application, and inside the terminal we can just stop the application and then we can just paste this command and then we need to hit enter. So the material UI will be then installed within very few moments. So then we need to wait till it completes the installation of the material UI. Now the material UI has been installed and now we can just restart our application as well. First thing is now we need to import something from the material UI. So it can be the from /MUI material @MUI material. So now we need to import the app bar from the material UI, and the app bar is like a basic nav tag in the HTML but with a predefined styles. So it contains a blue background color as well inside that. So now we can just use here the app bar. So we can have here the app bar, and now inside this app bar we can just enter the hello. So if we can now save, so now we need to just call this header component as well. But where we need to call the header? So we want the header component to be available throughout the application, because the header should be available on all of the pages inside the application. So for that, now we can just move on, and then we need to just move on to the app.js, which is the root file of the components inside our application. And here we are now rendering the component which contains all of the page props. So here what we can do is now we can just define here the fragment inside that. So the fragment is like a container which contains the child elements inside that. So it's available in the React, so we can use the fragment. After that we can just wrap the component with the fragment. Now we are wrapping the component, but here before the component now we need to render here the header as well. So now with this approach the header will be available throughout the whole application, because after the header then only we are rendering the component. So now if we now save, if we now just move on to the application, so now you will see now we got the hello inside that, which is available in from the header. So now we can just move on to the header and then we can just close other files as well. So now as we are just defining the hello, we can define here some links and the tabs as well. But now we want to just design the navigation bar, and now the navigation bar is not looking good, so we need to work on that as well. So now after the app bar we have here the toolbar inside the material UI. So the toolbar is like, it will give you a structure of how the navigation bar items will be then aligned onto the navigation bar. So it provides you a structure to align all of the items inside the navigation bar, and it gives you the real look and feel of how the navigation bar looks, and it just extends the capability of the navigation bar. So in the toolbar, the first thing that we can do is we can just save, and then you will see now we got the bigger navigation bar, and it contains all of the structure of how the navigation bar looks. And after that, the first thing that we want to do is we want to add the icon in that application. So we want to add the logo of the application. So for the logo, again we can just move on to the material UI, and then we can just move on to the icons. So you can see now we have the material UI icons, so we can just click on that, and now you can see this is a bookstore application, so we can just have here the book. So we can search for the book, and now you can see now we have some books there as well. So now you can see now we have the menu books. So now we can just copy this component inside that. So we need to copy this, but before copying this, now we need to just install the material UI icons as well. So now you can see this is the following package as the MUI icons / material. So we can just copy this, and then we can just move on again to our application in the terminal window, and then we can just write npm install and this package name @MUI /icons - material. So now the material UI icons will be then installed in our application as well, and the material UI icons are now installed, and now we can just restart the application again with the npm run dev. And now what we can do is now we can just click on that book icon, and then we can just select any of the icon as well. So if you want the outline, then you can see we have the outline, we have the rounded approach, we have the two-tone, and then we have the sharp as well. So now we will just move on with the filled, and then we will just click on that icon, and then we will just copy that icon from there. And after that, now we will just move on to the application, and then we need to add here into the top of our application. So now this is a component, so now we can just use this as a regular component. So this is the advantage over the material UI, that it provides you some components that we can just use as per in the React. So now the first thing that we want to add here will be the menu icon, like the menu book icon. So if we now save, and if we now just move on to the application again, if we now just refresh the page, And now you will see we have the menu icon available onto the top left corner of our application. And now you can see this is the logo of the application as well. So we can just move on, and then we can just provide here the SX prop. We need to provide here the SX prop, and the SX prop is used to provide some additional CSS styling that we want to give. So now here we can just provide here the styling, and then we can just have here the font size. So we can just increase the font size to the 26 pixels. So if we now save, so now you will see the size of the logo will be then increased. And after that, now we can just move on, and then we can just render some links onto our application. The first link will be the home page, so we can just click on the home. So the home page should be then rendered, and after that there will be a link of the all books, in which we can just click on the all books now, and then all of the books should be then rendered, and the route should be changed. So for that, now again we want to move on to the application again, and now we need to render here some tabs. So we can use the tabs from the material UI. So we can just use the box. So the box is like a container inside our application. It is same like the div. So as we are using the material UI, so I don't need to use the HTML. So the box is just a parent container, and inside that now we want to use the tabs. So with the tabs, we have the ability to switch between the different tabs of our application. So it provides you an ability to for the tabs. So if you will just move on to the material UI, and if you will just search for the tabs in the material UI, then you will see there will be some tabs like this. Now you can see this item 1, we have the item 2 and the item 3. So we want these tabs onto a navigation bar as well. So the first page, so if we open the home page of our application, so the first tab should be then highlighted. And if we want to move on to the second page with the books page, so then the books tab should be then highlighted. So we want these tabs like this. We have the active, we have this active as well. So now we want to use these tabs, but how can we use that? So we want to add here the tabs, and the tabs is the parent tabs container that we can use. And after that, now inside that, now we need to wrap every single link inside that with the component of the single tab, not the tabs. And after the tab, now we want to add some content inside the tab as well. So we need to add the label. So we have the label prop inside the tab, in which we can provide any label to the tab. So in this label we can just provide the home, and after that we can just copy this tab, and then we can just paste another tab here, and this will be the label of the all books. If we now just save, if we now just move on to the application, now you can see now we have two types inside the application. We have the home, and then we have the all books tabs inside our application. Everything is working perfectly fine. So we want to align these tabs onto the center of the web page. So for that, we want to provide some custom CSS styling for the box, which is a div. So we can just give the display at the specific display for this box. So the display will be equals to the flex. So we will use here the CSS flex box styling here. So the display would be the flex, and after that we need to provide the margin. So for the margin, we need to add a margin from all sides. It should be the auto, so it will be automatically aligned to the center from the all of the sides if we provide the margin equals to the auto. So if we now just save, if we now just refresh the application, now you can see now we got the home and the all books routes inside the center of the navigation bar. And now what we can do, and then we need to change some stylings onto the home and the all books tab. So for that, now we can just move on to the parent tabs, and then there is a prop of the text color. So we can provide the text color, and the text color we can provide the inherit. So the inherit prop is like we want to inherit it from the parent. So now you can see the color is now the white of the tabs, but if we now just click on the tabs, so now the tabs should be active tabs. But how can we do that? So now inside the tabs, as we saw in the material UI, so if we click on home tab or any of the tab, then the tab was highlighting, and then if we just change to any other tab, so that tab was highlighted. So now we need to follow the same approach. So if we just click on the home, so the home page should be then highlighted, and if we now just click on the all books, so the all books page should be then highlighted. So for that, now what we can do, so we have a value prop inside the tabs which contains the values of all of the children tab elements. So it works like an array. So the first element tab will get the value as the 0, and the second tab will contain the value as the 1. So in the tabs, if we provide the value equals to the 0, so then you will see the first tab will be then highlighted, and then you can see now this is highlighted and then this is not highlighted. And if we provide the value equals to the 1, so it will just target this tab because it starts from the index 0. So if we now just save, so now you can see the all books tab will be then highlighted. After that, if you will just change the color of the navigation bar as well, so then you will see there will be the underline as well behind the tabs as well. So for that, now we can just move on, and then we can just provide the dynamic value for the tabs. So whenever we will change any tab, so that tab should be then highlighted. So for that, now we can just move on, and then we can just provide the on change prop as well for the tab. So in the on change, we will have the function of the handle change. So we want to add the function as the handle change inside that. So in the handle change, we will just handle the values of the tabs as well. So we want to declare the const handle change would be equals to the function which will contain the event and the value as the parameters inside that. So the by default all of the components give the events for changing the event, but tabs gives an additional event as the value which will contain the value of the target tab which was clicked. So for that now we can just move on. But here for providing the values we need to use the state, because now we need to change the values dynamically. So we want to add the state to store the values. So for that again we need to use the use state, and we can use the snippet of the use state. The first it will contain the value, and then it will contain the function at the set value. By default value will be undefined, and after that we want to give the value, not the hard-coded value but the actual value which was available in the state. And after that in the handle change function, now what we can do is we want to add here the set value. So the set value will contain the actual value that we are now getting with the event. So first we are getting with the event. Now we don't need to work with the event. Now we need to work with the actual value that was declared. So what are we doing here is now we are now defining the tabs with the onChange function. So whenever any tab will be then changed, the handle change function will be then called, and it gets an event and the value as the props. And then you can see now we got the set value as the actual value that which tab is then clicked. So if we now just save, if we now just move on to the application, if we now refresh the page, and now you can see initially no any tab would be then highlighted. But if we now just click on the home, and now you can see the home tab is now highlighted. But if we now just click on the all books, and now you can see the all books tabs is now highlighted. So now we have done with the tabs part, and now you can see all of the tabs are now working perfectly fine. So everything is working perfectly fine in our application. And now the next thing that we want to do is we want to move on to the specific route as well. So if we want to click on the home, so we should be rendered to the home page of our application that we are currently in. And then if we want to click on the all books, now we need to move on to the all books page of our application. But how can we do that? So we have a use router hook inside the Next.js which allows you to do that. So we also have the link, and then we can just render the link inside the tabs as well. But the use router hook is also available, in which we can use it onto the dynamic way. And now we need to import the use router. So it will be the use router, and now you can see the router is now imported. And now we want to declare here the router variable, and we want to give the reference of the use router to that variable. So it will be the const router will be equals to the use router hook. So we want to give here the reference of the router to the router, and now all of the properties and values and the function would be then available inside the router variable. And after that now we can just handle the values dynamically. Now what we can do is now we can just render the conditional statement, like if the value is equals to the 0, then we need to move on to the home page of the application. But if the value is equals to the 1, then we need to move on to the /books page of the application. So we can just render that condition here. So we can just have the if condition, like the if the value that we got is equals to, like if we have the value is equals to the 0, then we want to add the router dot push. So we have the push method inside the router which pushes the URL. So we can just add here the router dot push into the home page of our application, and then we can just render the else if case, and else if the value is equals to the 1, then we can add here the router dot push. So it will just push to the books page of the application. So we can just add here the /books. So if we now just save, if we now just move on to the application, so now we can refresh the page once again. And now if we want to click on the home, then you can see now we are into the home page. But if we now just click on the all books, and now you can see now we are into the /books page of our application. So now the routing is also working perfectly fine in our application. So as we are just moving to the home page, and then the home is highlighted, and then if we are just click on the all books, and then you can see the all books is now highlighted as well. So everything in our application till now is working perfectly fine. And now the application is working perfectly fine. And now if you want to change the color of the navigation bar, so like you will see, this is the default color of the Material UI which it provides inside the app bar. So if you want to change this color, so we can just move on to the app bar, and then we can just provide the SX prop as we have done with the logos. So SX prop is used for the custom CSS styling, and after that we have a key as the BG color to change the background color inside that, and we can just change the BD color to this color. So I have just copied a color from the website, so it is a C83576. So we can just use this BG color. So if we now just save, if we now just move on to the application, now you can see now we got this background color onto our application as well. So we have the home, and then you can see we have the underline as well in the home. and it was hidden in the blue color because it had the same colors as the blue and the blue background as well. And then you can see the home. If we now click on the home is highlighted. If we now just click on the all books, then you can see the all books is now highlighted. So everything in our application is working perfectly fine, and then we have also changed the background color of our application as well. So now we have just completed the header of the application, and now we have to move on, and now we need to build the components to render the list of the books inside that application as well. So now let's start building that components. And now the header of the application is completed, and the next thing that we can do is we want to render the list of all of the books inside our application. So we can just create a regular React component again, which will be the reusable component, which will be the list of all of the books that we want to render. So on the home page as well, we will use that list, and in the all books page as well, we will use that list, but we will just provide the different data. Like in the home page, we only provided the featured book data, but in the all books page, we will provide the data of all of the books. So let's start with that. So now we need to move on to the components, and then we can create another component as the book list.js. So we have book list.js, and now inside that, first we will use again the array-fce to add the default import of the React, and then the component name, and then returning the component, and after that exporting the component as well. And now inside the book list, now we need to get the data. So first we need to get the data inside the book list as well, and we need to pass the data from the index.js page. So as we are now getting here the books, so we need to return here the component as the book list. So we can just have here the book list, and now we need to add the data. So it will be the data would be equals to the books. So if we now just save, if we now just move on to the book list, so if we now just log the data inside the book list as well, and then we need to remove the log from there. After that, if we now just move on to the book list again, as we are now rendering the book list, so we can just render the data. So if we now just save, if we now just move on to the inspect again, if we now just move on to the console, and now you can see if we now just remove everything from there. So if we now just click on the home, and then you will see now we got the data as the 3 featured books inside our application. And now we need to work on rendering part of the books inside our application. So for that, we again will use the material UI cards component with that. So we can just move on again to the MUI.com, and then we will just use the grid system of the material UI with the cards. So we can just move on to the material UI grid. So we will use this grid system inside the material UI, and the grid system has the 12 column grid layout. So if you will just add any grid inside our application, so it will just cover the full width of the screen, and it will just divide that into 12 columns. So either you can just add only single content inside this 12 column, and either you can just align any content, like you can just provide a navigation bar into the 2 columns, and the items into the 2 columns, and any into the 2 columns. So you can just provide any data for the any number of columns. So it will contain the 12 columns, and you can render each item, and then you can just add some custom number of columns you want to give on each item. Like here, if you will just check, if we now just scroll down, now you can see now we got the access equals to the 8. So now this box inside this container having the 8 columns, and this box having the 4 columns, and then you can see again this box is having the 4 columns, and this box is having the 8 columns. And I have a dedicated tutorial onto the material UI grid, so you can just watch that out as well. And then you can see we have some multiple breakpoints as well. So we have the access equals to the 8, MD equals to the 8, and then you can say we have the access equals to the 6, and the MD equals to the 6. So it means that from the access to the MD, it will just get the 6 columns onto the screen. Like it will contain it will cover half screen with that, because the screen is of 12 columns. And then you can see if we have the access equals to the small, so from the access to the medium, it will get the 6 columns onto the screen. So now if I show you an example once again as the real world, and now you can see now our screen is the access screen, which is the extra small screen. And then you can see from the extra small to the medium, it will get the 6 columns onto the web page. So as we have only the 12 columns, so 6 columns is being rendered here, and 6 columns is being rendered here. But if we now just move on, and then if we now just have some bigger screen size, so then you can see now we have the medium screen size, and then you can see from the medium we got the content as the 8, and then we got the content as the 4 for this item. And this means that from medium to any available screen size, we need to render 8 columns, and then we need to render the 4 columns. So this is how the grid system works, and then we will just use the card from the material UI as well. So we can just move on to the card, and then you can see we have some predefined cards in which we don't need to design the cards from the custom CSS styling. So then you can see now we got this card, we got this card as well, and then we will just specifically use this card from that because it has a button as well. So we will use this card from the material UI. So now we can just move on to the application, and then you can see now we got all of the list of the data. So the first thing that we want to do, we want to add here the grid system of the material UI. Now we need to render the data inside the grid system. So we want to just align all of the list items into the grid system. So for that we want to use the grid system from the material UI. So we need to import something again from the MUI material. It will be at the rate MUI material, and after that it would be the grid. So for now, if we want to add here the grids, so first we need to define the grid as the container of all of the child grids. So the first grid will be the container, and the second we need to add for the items. So for the container, we need to provide the prop as the container only. So this will specify that this grid is the container of all of the child grids. And now we need to render all of the child grids here. So for rendering all of the child grids, first we will just dynamically map through the data of all of the elements inside that. So we will just have here the data dot map. So the map is used to iterate over the data, and it returns an array as well. So just we will use here the book, and then what we can do is we can just add the callback function, and in the callback function we will just render here every single grid item with that. So this will be the item grid inside that. So this will be the item, and after that we need to specify the grid as the item. So now this is the item grid. So for specifying the item grid as well, we need to add the prop as the item. So now what we are doing here is, now first we are now just defining the grid functionality. So for defining the grid functionality, we want to add the grid, and we need to specify the prop as the container. So then you will see the component will have the flex container behavior, and after that if you want to specify the grid for the item, then you can see now we can specify the grid as the item here. And after that now we need to provide the data. So for that it will contain the key, and the key will be equals to, because React needs a key, so we can add here the book dot slash id underscore id. So this will be the key. And now what we need to do here is, now we need to create one more component here, and it can be the book item.js, which will just render all of the book items inside that. So we can just move on, and then we can just declare one more component here. It can be the book item.js. And now inside this component, now we need to get all of the values. Like we want to get here the name, like the title of the book. So we want to get the description of the book, we want to get the ID of the book, and then we want to add here the author of the book. So it will be the author, and after that there will be the image URL of the book as well. So now these are the props that we need for this component. So we have here the book item, and now we will render the book item for every single book. So this will contain a card, so every book will then contain a card inside that. So we can just add here the book item.js will be the book item, and after that we need to provide some props to the book item as well. So the book item will contain the props as it will contain the title, and the title will be equals to the book dot title. After that we need to add the author. So we want to add the book dot author, and after that we want to add here the description. After that the description, I think the description is not available, so we need to remove that. And after that it will contain the ID. So we want to add the ID would be equals to the book dot underscore ID, and after that we need to add the image URL. So we can add an image URL, it would be equals to again the book dot image URL. So now we have some props inside that. So we have the title, we have the author, we have the ID, and then we have the image URL as well inside the book item. So here now we need to render all of the things. So here what we can do is, now we can just render here the cards for each book item. So for that again we can just move on to the card component, and then you can see now we have this card. So we can just move on to the code of this card. So this will show you the code, and then you can see now we got the card here. Now what we can do is, now we can just copy this card from there. So we can just copy the card, fill the card from there, and then we can just paste this card here. So we can just remove here the div, and then we can just paste this card here, and after that we need to just import every component here. So we need to import the card from the material UI. So we need to import the card action area from the material UI, and then the card media from the material UI, and then the card content from the material UI, and then from the typography, and then the typography again. And after that we want to just move on, and then we want to just add the card actions, and then we want to import the button as well. So now everything is now imported, and if we now just move on to the localhost 3000, and now you can see now for the each grid item, now you can see now we are getting the cards onto our web page as well. So now this is how the grid system works. So it allows you to get some cards onto the web page as well. So now you can see, now we didn't use the CSS to design the cards, so we will just use the React card component inside the material UI, because it saves a lot of time from writing the CSS from the scratch. So we can use the CSS from there as well. So now you can see the cards are now being rendered, and now we need to send the data for that card as well. And now you can see, now we got the card media. So now we don't need to use the card media, so we can just use the image tag from the HTML, and then we can just provide the source and the image URL. So we have an image URL, and after that we can just have the alt will be the title. And now you can see in the card action area, after you can see now we have the lizard, so we need to remove this, and then we can just add the title again. After that, what we can do, as in the description, we can just add here the author inside that, so it will be the author instead of the description. And after that, now you can see now everything is working perfectly fine. So if we now just save, if we now just move on to the application, now you can see now we have all of the cards here. So now the card stylings is not good, so we need to fix the card stylings as well. But now everything is working perfectly fine. And now before moving ahead, and now you can see our cards are now being rendered behind the app bar as well, behind the header of the application as well. So we want to move on to the header again, and then we want to specify the app bar position would be equals to the sticky. So it will just prevent from rendering behind the navigation bar. And now you can see, now we will just align the elements on the bottom of the navigation bar and not inside the navigation bar. Now you can see everything is working perfectly fine. Now we need to work on the stylings of each card inside that. So now we want to specify some stylings inside that. So now you can see in the SX prop, now we have the width. So now we want to remove this max width, and then we need to add here the width. The width will be equals to the 100% of the parent width. So we need to add the 100% of the width and the 100% of the height as well. So it would be the height would be equals to the 100%. And then we can just provide some width from the parent component as well, because now we are just dividing the width as the 100%. So we need to add the width for the parent as well. So now this grid, so inside this grid, now we can just specify the height. So it can be the height. So in the height, it would be around something like 500 pixels. And after that, we need to provide the width as well. So for the width, it will be equals to the 100% of the width, because now we need to specify some breakpoints as well for this. So now inside this grid, now we need to specify the breakpoints, like how many items we need to render for each book item, like how many columns we need for each book item. So for that, we can just specify the breakpoints. Like for the access, we need to provide here this 6. So now what means about the 6? So 6 is like 12 by 6 is the 2. So now the 2 book items. So now if we have the access screen, so for the access, so now 2 book items will be then available onto the screen. But if our screen is the small screen, so we need to remove the small, and in the small we will render here the 4, and the 12 by 4 is equals to the 3. So we will render 3 books on each of the columns inside that. So for the each column, so each book item will contain the 4 columns. So there will be 4 column 1 book, 4 column 1 book, and the 4 column 1 book. And after that we can just move on to the MD. And now for the MD, now we can just write the MD as the 3. So each book item will contain the 3 columns inside that. So the web page will contain 4 books at a time. And now we can just move on, and then we can just provide for the LG. So for the LG, it would be the 2. So what we are doing here is now we are now defining the access. So for the access, so each book item will contain the 6 columns onto the web page. So the 6 and the 6, because the grid is of the 12 columns. And then we have the SM prop. So for the SM, we will just have the book item as the columns equals to the 4. So each book item will contain the 4 columns. So there will be 4, 4, and the 4. And after that, for the MD, it will be the 3. So every book item will contain 3 columns, 3, 3, 3, 3. So there will be 4 books onto the web page. And then you can see for the LG, we will have here the 2. And for the LG 2, so each book item will contain 2 columns. So there will be around 6 books onto the web page as well. So if we now just save, if we now just move on to the application, now you can see, now we have same width for each of the column. Now you can see, now we got the mindset, and then you can see now we got the share button, and now you can see for this book and this book as well. So now we have the same styling and the same width and the height for every book inside that. And now inside this grid, now we have some, and now inside the parent grid, now we have some prop as the padding as well. So we can just provide some padding, like it would be the 1, and then we have the spacing as well. So for the spacing, each grid item will contain some spacing between them. Like we can define the spacings as the 2. So then you will see each grid item will contain some spacing between them. And after that, now we can just move on to the book item.js, and inside that file, now we need to just specify some things. And now we need to have some more stylings here. And now you can see, now we have the card action area. So now we don't need that component, so we need to remove that card action area from there. After that, now you can see now we got the card media and then the card action area, so we don't need to import them. Now we need to work on the image part. So for the image, we can just render the image inside this div. So we can just render the image inside this div, and then we can just render this image. And after that, we can just provide some stylings to the div as well. So we can just provide the style prop, and we want to add an object with the CSS styling. So we want to add here the width. So we want to give the width of the 100% of the screen, and then we want to add the height. So height would be equals to something around 50%. So for each card, we need to add the width and the height at the 100% and the 50%. So for that, we want to specify the width here of the image. So the width will contain something around 100%, and the height would be equals to the 100% again. So now what we are doing here is now we are now just defining the div, which is the container for this image, and then you can see now we are now just giving the width and the height equals to the 100% for the container. So if we now just save, and now you can see we can just refresh the page. Now you can see the each grid card will contain 50% of the image, and then the 50% of the text content with that, which will contain the title, the author, and the buttons. Now you can see now we got some stylings for the cards as well. And now again we want to move on to the card content, and then we want to add the SX prop again. So the SX prop, it will contain the width would be equals to the 100% once again, but the height, we only need to give the height as the 30%. So we want to add the height would be equals to the 30% of the parent card. So if we now just save, if we now just move on to the application, then you can see now we have the share button onto the bottom of the page. Now the card content contains the 30% of the height of the card. So 50% for the image, 30% for the content, and less 20% buttons here inside that. And now we need two buttons there as well for the edit and the delete. So we want to add two buttons. So it would be so we can just copy that button here, and then we can just paste another button there. So the color would be equals to the primary. But if we now just move on to the application, now you can see now we got the edit and the delete buttons, and now they are looking good. And now what we can do is we can specify some more stylings to the card, and now you can see the cards are not looking good. So for that, we can just provide some more stylings to the SX. So we can just have the border radius. So we should have the rounded borders with that. So we can have a border radius, and it would be something around 3. And after that, we need to add the box shadow as well. So we have the box shadow. So the box shadow will contain this string, which will contain the 5 pixels vertically and the 5 pixels the horizontally, and the 10 pixels of the blur, and the color would be #CCC. It is like a little gray color. So if we now just save, and now you can see now we got the styling, now we got the mindset, we got the quiet, and now you can see we also got the box shadow. And now we can just have here the hover functionality as well with that. So we want to add here inside these strings, and now we can just add here the hover as well. So we can just add we can just type the control and the space, and then we can just search for the hover. Now you can see this is the hover, and in the hover now we want to create an object of the CSS stylings for the hover as well. It will contain the box shadow. So we will just double the box shadow as we have defined inside the previous state. So we can just copy that, and then we can just double the box shadow. So with the 5px, we will add here the 10, and here as well we have the 10, and here will be the 20. So if we now just save, we have the hover effect as well with the double shadow, and then if we just hover over it, we have the double effect. Now the cards are looking good, and now what we can do is we can just add a box onto top of every card which has the featured box, as we can see in the OLX and other platforms as well. So we get the featured badge on all of the products which have the featured. So we can just also add the featured here as well on the top left corner of every card if that book is the featured book. So for that, now what we can do is we can move on to the book list again, and then we can just specify the featured prop here as well. So we can just have here some condition, like if we got the featured, so we can have here the book dot featured. So we will just have here the condition like if the book is the featured book, then we need to add the featured badge there as well. And after that, we want to add the featured inside the image as well. So for that, what we can do is we can just add the div with the position. So we can add the position for the relative. So we need to add the relative position inside this div, and now we want to add another div inside that, and the another div will contain the position as the absolute. So it will just get the styling with that. So we want to add the style would be equals to the position would be the absolute, and after that we can have here the absolute, and after that we can just define here some positions with that. So we can have here the top from the 0, so we will add here the top as the 0, so we can add inside the string. And after that, now what we can do is we can just add the featured. So if we now just save, and then you will see we will have the featured on the top of every image inside that. So we got the featured, and after that we can also style this featured as well. So we can just move on to the div which contains the featured, and then we can just also add some more styling, like we can have the background color. We can have background as it can be the gray or the red. So we can have the red background with that, and then you can see now we got the featured with the red background. And after that, now we can just move on, and then we can just define the width can be equals to the 20 pixels. So if we now just save, I think the width is not covered, so we can just define some width as it would be the 80 pixels. And now we have just defined the width at the 70 pixels and not the 50 pixels. And then you can see now we got the featured back here as well. And after that we can just provide some padding as well. So the padding, it will contain the padding as the 5 pixels from every side. So if we now just save, and then you can see we have the featured. I think the padding is now very big, so we can just provide the padding as the 2 pixels from every side. So I think the color red is not looking good inside the features, so we can just move on, and then we can just move on to the header, and then we can just copy this color from the header. So we can just copy this color, and then we can just again move on to the book item, and then we can just specify this color onto the background, and for the foreground color we can have the color as the white. If we now just save, and if we now just move on to the application, and now you can see if we now just refresh the page, and now you can see now we got the featured back for every product as well. So we got the featured here, and the featured here as well. Everything is working perfectly fine, and now we are able to get the featured products inside our application. And then we can just add some condition here as well. So we want to only render this div when the featured is true, so we can add this condition here. So if we have the featured, then only we need to render this featured tab with that. So then you will see now we have all of the products at the featured, only then we are rendering at the featured. So now we can just move on into the book item.js, and now once I will click on the edit, so now we should be moved on to the edit page. So for that we can just wrap this button inside the link. So we can just move on to link, and we don't need to import the link from the material UI, and we need to import the link from the Next.js. So we want to import the link. So we want to import the link from, it would be the next/link. So we want to import the link from the next link, and after that what we can do is we want to just wrap the buttons with the link. So we can add here the link. After that we can just render this button inside this link. Now we can just provide the ref prop with the link. So we can have the ref, so we can have the book/id. So we want to add the id as well. So as we are getting the id inside the props, so we can have the books/the id. So this is how can we do that. So now we have the book/id, as we are getting the id, so the id should be the same. So if we now just save, and if we now just refresh the page, and now you can see if we now just click on the edit, and then you can see now we got into the book detail page, and then you can see we have this id inside the route. And then if we now just click on this book, and then you can see again we got this id onto the URL. Again if you want to click on the edit, and then you can see now we got into the edit page of the book as well. So everything in our application is working fine, and now we have just completed the home page of our application. And now we want to move on to the all books page, in which we want to render the all of the books from the database. And now we can just follow the same approach as we are doing here. We can just move on to the books index.js page of the books, and then here also we can just have here the export const, it can be the get static props, and it will be an async function once again. And after that what we can do is we can just have all of the books here. So we can have a const books will be equal to the get all books, as we have done the get all books inside the front end folder. Inside that it will just get the get all books, and then we need to add the await as well. So it will be the await, and after that we need to just return it inside the props. So we can just have the return inside the props. So we need to add the props object. So the props object, it will be the books. If we now just save, and now you can see now we enter the books home, and it will also get the books. So what we can do is we want to just have here the book list again. So we can just have here the book list. The book list would be there. After that we need to render here the data. So the book list, the data will be equals to the books. and we can just provide the book list and the data will be equals to the books. So what it will do, so as we have just created the component as the reusable component, so we can just use here the reusable component of the book list inside the home page, inside the books index page as well. So if we now just save, if we now just move on to the application, now you can see if we just move on to the all books page, and now you can see now we get all of the books from the database as well. So everything in our application is working fine, and now you can see all of the books are now being rendered here inside that. And now what we can do is we can just provide some more custom stylings to the book as well. So for defining some custom CSS styling for the home page and the all books page here. So in the home page, the height should be the same like we have this height, but in the all books page, we want to just decrease the height of every book inside that. So what we can do is we can just move on to the book list, and then we can just receive here some prop, like we can just receive here the featured page. So we can have a featured page prop, and then we can just specify some height. So if we have the featured page, then we want to add here the height of the 500 pixels, but if we don't have the featured page, then the height would be something around 300 pixels. So if we now just save, if we now just move on to the index.js/pages, so we can just move on to the main index.js, and then we want to add the featured as the true. So we want to add here the featured page. But if we now just move on to the books index.js page, so the featured will not be available here. So if we now just save, and now you can see now we got the featured as the false here, and now you can see now we got these cards. But if we now just move on to the home, then you can see now we got bigger cards. So now we can just move on again to the book list, and now you can see the cards are very small. So we can just move on to the book list, and then it should be something around 400 pixels. So if we now just save, and now you can see inside the all books page, now we got some different height, and inside the home page, now we got the different height. And here as well, now you can see now this book is not the featured book, so we didn't get any featured tag, but these three are the featured. But these three, this Art of War, Psychology of Money, and the Rich Dad Poor Dad, does not have the featured tag. So we got these three as the featured tags with that. So now we are complete with the books rendering inside our application, as we have just completed the home page, and then we have completed the all page as well. So now we want to just work on the edit page and the add book page inside our application. So let's start with the add book page first. Start with the add books. What we will do, so we will create a form which will be used in the add and in the update operation as well, because in both add and update operations we need a form, and in the add the form will be empty at the initial state, and for the update the form will be filled with the data. So let's start. So I will create a component as a form component inside the components folder. So let's create a component as the form.js. So you need to click on the create file, and then you can have a form.js, and after that you can add a default setup of the blank React application. So you can write a RAFCE command, and it will create a basic setup of the React application. And now what we can do is we can just move on to the pages folder, and then we can just create another page route, and it can be the add. So we can just create another route inside the books folder, so it can be the add.js. So we can have the add.js, and after that what we can do is we can just create a function, and it can be as the add book or anything. So it can be add book, and after that we will just export this function as well. So we will just export default as the add book. So we can have the add book, and after that we will just return some JSX as well inside this code. So we can have the JSX, and we can have the add book inside the JSX as well. So now if we now just move on to the application, and if we now just have the /add, so now you will see there will be the add book inside the web page. So now you can see we have the add book inside that. After that the next step would be we can just move on to the header, and then we can create another route as the add book inside the header. So we have the home and the all books, and now we need to create another route as well as the add book. So we can just move on to the header again, and we can just create one more link inside that. So let's move on to the header, and there inside the header what we can do is we can just declare another tab inside that, and it can be the add book. So we can just copy and paste, and then we can write the add book inside that. We can have the add new inside that, and after that what we can do, we can just write another else if case, and in the another else if case we can just write here if the value. So we can have the else if, after that we can just check if the value is equals to the 2, because we have the add new at the 2 index, and after that in else if case we will write the router dot push. So we can just push to the books dash add. So we can have the slash books dash add. If we now just save, if we now just move on to the application, if we now just move on to the different route, we can on the home, And if we now just move on to the all books, now we are into the books page. And if we now just click on the add new, so now you can see now we are into the add book page as well. So everything is working perfectly fine in our application. And now we can just move on to the add book component, and there we can just remove that h1, and there we will render the add book component. So we can just create another component as the add.js, and there we will just create refce again, and there inside that we will just return the form as of now. So we can just return here the form. So it should be the form. So we will render here the form component, and after that we will just move on to the add.js, and here we will just render here the add book. We have the component as the add, so we will just write here the add. So if we now just save again, so now what we are doing here is now we are now returning here the add, which is a component that we have created, and in the add we will just write here the form. So if we now save, so now you can see now we have the form component running inside the add route. So everything is working perfectly fine again. So now what we can do is now we can just move on to the form, and then we can just define here the form as well. So now this form will be used for the update and for the add operation as well. So what we will do, so we will accept the props as the data. So we will just accept the props, and then we will just find the state, and then we will just conditionally render the state. So if we have the data, then we will render here the data inside the form. So and if we don't have the state, so we will render the empty form inside that. So let's start with that. So in the props, we can just define some component props, and it can be destructured as the data. So we can have the data, and then we will have here the onSubmit prop. So the onSubmit prop is being called from the parent component. So we need to get the data from this form to the parent component. So we have defined here the onSubmit, and with the onSubmit what we will do, so we will get the data inside the parent component. So when we will call the onSubmit, so we will just call this function, and then we will just pass the data inside the event, and then we will get the data inside that. And now we can just define the use state as well. So we can define the use state as the inputs and the set inputs, and then we will just define the use state, and then we will import that as well. So now what we will do is now we can just write some condition with the use state. So in the use state there will be a condition like when we have the data. So when we will have the data, then we need to render the data inside the state. So first there will be the title field, so we will add here the title, and then the title will be equals to the data.title. So we have the data.title because initially we want to fill the form as well. After that we can just move on, and then we can just move on to the author, and then the author will be the data.author. So we are referring to the data.author. After that we will just write a image URL. So we will add here the image URL, so it should be the data.image URL. And after that what we will do is now we will add here the featured. So the featured will be equals to the data.featured. These are the data, and then we will render another condition like when we have the data, then we need to fill this. If we don't have the data, then we need to fill the title as the empty string, then the author as well to the empty string, and for the image as well to the empty string as well, to the featured as well to the empty string as well. So page URL will be empty, the featured as well, and it should be the false, or we can just write the empty string with that. So we have this condition. So when we have the data, then we need to fill the form initially as well, but if we don't have the data, then we need to write the empty string with that. Now what we can do is now we can just move on, and then we can just define here the form tag as well. So we need to render here the only the form with that. So because this is just a form component, as this is a reusable form component, and then we need to give some styling to the form as well. So we can have the style prop, and the style would be equals to, we can have the width as the 80% of the available screen, and then we will add here the height, and we can have the 100% of the height as well. So we have the width of the 80% of the screen, and then we have the height of the 100%. And then we will just render here some typography. So we need to add some typography text with that. So now with the typography, so we can add a condition like when we have the data, then it should be the detail. So it should be the book detail, and then if we don't have the data, then it should be the add new book. So we have the add book when we don't have the data. And after that what we will do, and after that we will just define here the box, and the box we need to define the parent div inside the box. So we have the div, so we can just define some stylings to the box as well. So we can have the padding, and the padding would be something around, we can add the 3 of the box, and then we can just have the display to the flex. So we can have the display as the flex. We can add the display equals to the flex, and then we can add the flex direction. Flex direction can be the column. So now these are the things that we need, and after that now we need to render here some text fields as well. So for the text fields we can just have here the form label. So we need to add the label, and inside this label now we can just add the author, or we can just have here the title of the book, So we have the title, and after the title, now we need to render here the text field. So we can have here the text field. So we need to import the text field from the material UI only. And after that, now we have the form label as the title, and then we have the actual input tag, which is the text field. And then we need to add it for the author as well. So we can just add here the author, and after that we need to add here the image URL as well. So we need to add one more for the image URL, and after that we need to add for the featured as well. And for the featured, I think we don't need the text field, we would need a checkbox with the featured. So we need to add the checkbox from the material UI. So these are the things that we need. So we need the title, author, then we need the image URL. After the image URL, we need to add here the featured. So now what are we doing here is, now we are declaring a form, we are declaring a typography. Like if we have the data, then we have the book detail, and if not, we have the add book, and then we are just declaring a div, which is like a box, and then we are just defining some styles to that div. And after that, if we can just save, if we can just move on to the application, now you can see, now we have the add book page, and inside that we have the title, we have the author, and then we have the image URL as well. So now we need to just work on the stylings as well. So now you can see the checkbox is also there for the featured as well. So now we need to work on the styling part. So now what we can do, the first we need to add, so first we can just define some styling for this add book. So for that, we can just move on to the typography. We can just define the color. So the color of this would be, we need to add the specific color. So I will add a specific color as CC 5333. So this is the color. So if we now save, and now you can see, now we have the add book color. After that, now we can just have here the font weight. So the font weight would be equals to the bold. So we need to add the bold font. After that, we can just have some variant as well. So the variant, we can just define any variant. Like if you will hover over the variant, you will see there are so many tags like h1, h2, paragraph tag, body tag, overline tag as well. So by default is the body. So we need to add the variant as the h5. So we need as the heading. So we are just defining the h5, and after that we can just define some margin from the top as well. So for the empty, it means that the margin from the top. So we need to add for the one value, and after that we can just define some padding from all of these sides, and the padding can be equals to, like, we can just define the number as the 2. After that, if we now save, so now you will see, now we have the add book, and now we want this into the center of this page as well. So for that, we can just define the text align. So the text align would also be equals to the center. So if we now save, so now you can see, now we have the add book, and the add book is now into the center of the web page as well. I think it's not onto the center, and the form is not inside the center. So what we can do is, we can just move on to the form tag, and then we can just define the margin from all of these sides. It would be the auto. So we can have the margin as the auto. So if we now save, so now you can see the form is in the center of the web page as well. After that, what we can do is, we can just define some stylings for the input tags as well. So for the text fields as well. So for the text field, what we can do, first we need to define the styles for the label as well. So for the label, we can just define some SX prop for the label. So we can just define some margin from the top for all of the labels, because now you can see all are connected together. So we need to just have some distance between all of the labels and the text fields. So we can just define some SX prop. So before the component renders, we can have the const label SX would be equals to an object, and the object will contain some data, like it can be the margin from the top, and it can be equals to, we can have a margin of the 6, or we can have the margin of the 10 pixels from the top. So now we need to just define these styles for all of the labels. So we can just copy that label, and then we can just press Ctrl and F2. So this will select all of the labels, and after that we can just have the SX. The SX would be equals to the label SX. We can have the label SX. If we now just save, if we now just move on to the application, now you can see, now we have some margin from the top. So now you can see the author has the margin from the top, and then we have the image URL as well, and then for the title as well. And now what we can do is, we can just move on to the text fields, and then we can just have here the margin from all of the text fields as well, and the margin would be equals to the normal. So it will just provide normal margin for all of the text fields. So we need to copy this for all of the text fields as well, for this text field as well. So if we now save, so now you can see, now we have some distance between all of the elements of this form as well. And now we need to just render this checkbox into the left as well. So for that, what we can do is we can just move on to the checkbox. We can just have the SX prop. So for the custom styling, in the SX we can just have an object. It will contain the margin. From the right, it will contain the auto. So if we now save, so now you can see now the checkbox is into the right of the web page. So now you can see the checkbox is now also aligned into the left of the web page. And now what we can do is we can just down declare here the button to submit the form. So we can have the button. So we can have a variant of the button. So we need the button variant to the content. So the content button is like a button with a filled color. So if you will by default just add a button, so it will just add like a link, so it will just perform like a link. But now if you provide here the variant, then it will be the content, then it will be a filled button. After then we have the submit data inside the button as well. If we now save, so now you can see now we have the submit button as well inside that. And now you can see the form is looking good. And now we can just define some borders onto the form as well. So now we can just move on to the form tag, and here we can just define the box shadow. So we can have a box shadow, so we need a shadow of the form. So for that we can just have the 10 pixels from the horizontally, 10 pixels we have the vertically. After that we need the 20 pixels of the blur, and then we can just define the color hash ccc. And after that, if we now just save, and now you can see now we have some shadows on the form as well. After that we can just define the border radius. So we need the radius on all of the borders, so we need the rounded borders, so we can add a border radius, and it can be the 10 pixels. So if we now save, and now you can see now we have the border radius as well into the form as well. So now everything is working perfectly fine. And now what we can do, now our form is now rendered, and now we need the data of this form as well. So for defining the data, what we can do, now we need to handle this form state. So for that, now what we can do is we can just move on to every text field, and then we can just define some identifier to this form input. So we can have the name. So name is like identifier which we can provide. So the name can be equals to the title, and make sure you are giving the name of the same state that you are defining here. So you are defining the title equals to the title, so make sure they both are same. So we need to handle the state of the form from this name properties and the state properties, so everything should be same. So we need to define the name equals to the title, so we need to add the name here, and it can be equals to the author. And after that, in this text field we need to add the name, can be equals to the image URL. After that we need to add for the checkbox, and for the checkbox what we can do is we can just define some name. Name can be equals to, it can be a featured. So if we now save, so now there would not be any changes onto the screen. So we have just the checkbox, and then we have all of the text fields. So now to handle this form, now what we can do is we need to define the values for every text field, and then we need to update their values upon entering anything onto that text field. So now what I mean is now we need to handle the state of the form. So we need to add here the value to the form, and then we need to add the onChange function, onChange prop to the form, which will be called whenever anything will entered into this form. So for that we need to add the value, and the value as we have defined in the states, so it would be the inputs. So we have the input objects, and it can be the inputs.title for the title, and then we need to just define the onChange function, and for the onChange we need to add the onChange. And now we can just define the function as the handle change for all of the text fields. So for the onChange and the handle change, we need to define these things for all of the text fields as well. So we need only handle change function to handle this state for all of the text fields. So this will be a dynamic form handling that we will use. After that we need to same with the checkbox as well. So if we now save, so there would be some errors onto the screen that the handle change is not defined. So we can just define the handle change as well before the return statement. So we can have a const handle change would be equals to a function which will contain the event as the parameter. We can just leave it empty. So if we now just save, and now you will see if we just write anything into the title or in the author, it will not accept any value, just because we didn't add any value inside that. Now the values are the empty strings, and then we have just defined the values as the empty strings only, because now we have the value equals to the input.title, and the title is also an empty string as of now. And now what we can do to have the values and to have the data, we need to move on, and then we need to just update the state inside the handle change. So for that what we can do is we can just target the property names of all of the forms. Like we can just target the property name with the event.target.name, and it will give the name as the title, and this will give the name as the author. And after that we need to do for every text field, and then you will see we have the title and the author same in this state, so they both will be connected. So we need to add the event.target.name, which will grab the name property, and then we need to just grab their value from the event.target.value. So for that we can just move on to the set inputs, and inside the set inputs what we can do, first we need to have the previous state, because once we will enter anything into a form, so it will just accept only that value and all of the previous data will be lost. So for preventing that, first we need to get the previous state of the use state, and then what we can do is we can just render here an object. We can just return an object, and the object will contain first the previous state. So we need to add the previous state, and then we need to add the form handling. So we need to add the e.target.name. So it will just grab the name property of every text field. Like, so for the text field of the title, it will grab the title, it will grab the name equals to the title. So we will just have here, so this will give you the title, and then this will be linked to this title, and after that it will just grab the value. So for grabbing the value, we can have the event.target.value. So this is the dynamic form handling. Suppose once we will enter anything to this title field, so it will just move on and it will just select the event.target.name. So it will just select this state property like the title, and then it will provide the value, and same it will do for the author, for the image URL, and for the featured as well. So this is the only code for the handle change, and this is very small code, but it is fully dynamic. So it will just grab the properties of the state and it will just update their values. So if we now just save, if we now refresh the page, and now you can add anything into the title and the author as well. Now you can see once you are entering anything into the title, so values are being rendered on all of the text fields. So I think we have just defined the values like the input.title for every text field, so we need to change. So this would be input.author, so this would be the inputs dot image URL, and this would be the inputs, and the checkbox would be the inputs dot it would the featured. So if we now just save, if we now just move on to the application, now you can see the title have the different value, the author have the different, image has the different, and for the featured is also the different value. And now we have rendered the form, and then form handling is also done, and now we need to get the data of this form as well. And how can we do that? Now we can just define the onSubmit prop to the form. So whenever the form will be submitted, the onSubmit prop will be then called, the onSubmit function will be then called, and the onSubmit will contain a function, and it can be a handle submit. So we can have a function as the handle submit, and we can just define this function as well before the return statement. So we can have a const handle submit. It would be the function which will contain the event as the parameter, and after that what we can do, the HTML form sends the data on submitting the form. So it sends the data to the URL as well, and then you can see the page will also reload. But to prevent that, now what we can do is we can just call the event.prevent default. So it will just prevent the default behavior of the HTML forms, like it sends the data to the URL and it refreshes the page, but with that the page would not be refreshed. And after that we can just log the values of the inputs as well. We can just log the values of the inputs. So if we now save, if we now just move on to the inspect and into the console window, and now what you will see, once we will enter anything inside any form, so we can just move on to the title. We can just have the title as the new book, we can have the author, we can have the Nikhil, we can have the image URL, anything as the image URL, the HTTP, anything into the image URL, and then featured. So if we now just click on this submit, and I think the values are not being rendered, so I think something is missing. And now you can see we have just defined the button, so we need to just define the type of the button as well. So we need to define the type equals to the submit if we are using with the form. So if we just now save, if we now just click on the submit again, and then you can see we also got the data. We got the data as the new book, we got the author as the Nikhil, we got the image URL as this, and then we got the featured. Now the featured is giving an empty string, but it should be the boolean value, so we need to fix that also. But now you can see every other field is now working perfectly fine, and now we are getting the values of all of the fields as well. And now what we can do is now we can just fix the featured as well. So we can just move on to the featured. So now for the featured, now we need to move on to the state, and now we need to just remove this empty string, and it would be by default the false. We need to add the false. And now what we can do is now we can just move on to the checkbox, and now the value don't work for the checkbox. So instead of the value, we can just move on, and then we can just define the checked. So the checked state is there. So if the checked is true, the checkbox will be checked, and if the checked is equals to the false, the checkbox will not be checked. After that, in the on change, now we don't need the handle change inside that. we only need to handle the state here. So what we can do is we can just grab the value as the event, and after that we can just have the set inputs. And in the set inputs, as we have done previously, we need to grab the previous state. So we need to render the previous state first with the previous state, and after the previous state, what we can do is we can just target the featured property. So we can have a featured, and the featured would be equals to the event dot target dot checked. So we have the checked property for the checkboxes. Like if we have the checked true, then it will give you the true, and if we don't have the checked, then it will give you the false. So this is the form handling of the checkbox tag. So we need to just define the on change. We need to just set the values as the event dot target dot checked, and then we need to just define the property as the checked equals to the inputs dot featured. So if we just now save, if we just now move on to the application once again, we can just define anything into the title. We can have the title of the new book, we can have the author as in Nikhil, we can have the image URL, anything. And then if we just move on to the featured, if we just add anything into the featured, if we just click on the submit, and then you can see we got all of the fields, and then we got the featured equals to the true as well. But if we don't add the featured, if we just now click on the submit, and now you can see the featured is now equals to the false, and now everything is working perfectly fine. And now we are just making this checkbox from the controlled state to the uncontrolled state, as we are just grabbing the state and then we are just controlling the state manually. So now this checkbox is in the uncontrolled state, as we are just manually updating the state. So now everything is working perfectly fine, and now we got the data of this form as well. And now what can we do is we can just move on to the add.js, and inside that, as we are just sending the form, we can just create here a function. It can be a get form data, and it can be a function which will grab the data as the parameter. And what it will do, now we need to just grab the data of this child form component into the parent component. So for that, as we are just passing here a function as the onSubmit, so we need to enter here the onSubmit as well. So for that, what we can do here is we can just move on to the submit, handle submit, and now after the form is submitted, is now we need to call the onSubmit function. So the onSubmit will be equals to the function here. So we need to add the onSubmit from the parameter, and in the onSubmit we need to send the data as the inputs. So now what it will do is once we will submit the form, it will just call the onSubmit function, and then we are just passing here the data. And to get this data inside that, we need to just move on to the parent add, and then we need to add here the prop. It can be onSubmit, and the onSubmit we need to add the function as the get form data. So we have the get form data, and what are we doing here? We are just having the onSubmit, and the get form data is now pointed to this function, and after it is pointed to this function, it will just grab the data as the event. So in the event, we will get here the data. So, and that's why I have added the parameter as the data. If we just now log the values of the data as well, so we will just log the data. After that, we can just move on to the form.js, and then we need to just remove the log from there, because now we are logging the data from the parent component. If we just now save, if we now remove everything from there, if we just now click on the submit, and then you can see we got the data from the add.js, which is the parent component. So this is how we can just get the data from the child to the parent component. So now we need to work on sending the new request. Once we are just getting the data of the form, now what can we do is now we can just send a new request to the database to add this data inside our collection. And now once we are getting the data inside the get form data, we can make a request to the database to add a new book inside the database as well. So for that, we can just import the Axios from the Axios again. So we need to add the import the Axios from the Axios. So now we have imported the Axios, and now we need to send the data. So we can just create a custom function as well. So we can just have the function as the const the send request, and it would be a async function. So we can have the async, and after that we can just have here the const, it would be the response, it would be equals to, we can have the await again. So we can just have here the Axios dot, we can just have here the post functions. So because we need to send a request to the database, and then we need to send a book to the database, so we can just have here the Axios dot post. So I think so we don't need to define the function here, so we can just remove this function. So we can just move on to the front end and the utils.js, and inside that we can just define the function, because now we are making the request for the database inside the utils folder only. So we can just have the utils folder, and inside that we can just create a one more function. We can have a export const, we can have a send book, and after that it will also be an async function again. So we have the async, and the async will contain a book inside the parameter. So we need to add here the book, or it can be a data of the book. And after that, what we can do is we can just make a request to the database. So we can just again have the const, we can have the response will be equals to the axios. So we need to have the axios dot post because it is a post request. So we need to have the post function with that. And now we need to send the URL, and the URL would be same, I think. So we need to have the localhost API slash books. So we need to add this URL again here. And after that, in the second parameter, we need to add the data, and we need to add the data inside the object. So in the object, we can just have the data. So what are the data that we need? So we need to have the title. So the title will be equals to the data dot title. After that, we need to have the author. So the author will be equals to the data dot author. And after that, we need to add the image URL. So we need to add the image URL as the data dot image URL. And after that, we need to add the featured. So we can have the featured, and the featured would be equals to the data dot featured. So the featured would be in the boolean values. So we need to convert this value inside the boolean as well. So we need to have the boolean. So now these are the things that we need. So we need the title, we need the author, we need the image URL, and then we need the featured. So this is the only thing that we need to require inside the axios.post. And now we need to add the await as well. And now after this, we can just have some validation. Like we can just check like if the response dot status is not equals to the 200 or is not equals to the 201, then we need to just return new error again. Like it can be database request rejected. And now after we have just passed this validation check, if the response dot status is the 201, then what we can do is we can just have the const data would be equals to the response dot data. So we need to get the data from the response, as we are sending a newly created book from the backend, so we will get that book as well. So we need to just await for this response dot data as well. And after that, we can just return the data. So if we just now save, if we just now move on to the add.js, and now once we are getting the form data, instead of logging the data, we can just send a new request to the database. So we have the send book from the API helpers, and after that we have the data. So we need to send the data as we are receiving the data here, and then we are getting the then statement, and in the then we will get the value. So then we will just log the value as well. So we can just log the value. That would be the value. If we just now save, if we just now move on to the application once again, so now you can see now we have the title equals to the new book. So we need to remove that. So we can have the title. So we can have here the new book, and it can be the atomic habits. And then the author can be equals to, and the author would be equals to the James Clear. After that, we can just add the image URL. I have just grabbed the image of this atomic habits, and then we need to just remove the feature tag. So if we now just click on the submit, we can just move out to the console, and then we can remove everything from there. So we can just click on the submit, and now you can see we have made the request to the database. And once we'll move out to the network tab, and then you can see we have made a request to the books. I think the request is pending. I think we didn't got any response. So we have an error. So we are just, so we have already declared the data inside the parameters. So we need to just remove this data. So it can be the response data, and then we need to just return here the response data. So we can have a response data. Now we have one more error. So we have missed one thing. So we have missed the price inside the book. So if you see the model of the book, and then you can see we also have the price tag, but we didn't add the price inside this form. So what we can do is we can just declare one more field of the text field. So we can just copy the last one, and then we can just add here one more text field. We can just paste here, and then instead of the image URL, it would be the price. And for the price, what we can do is we can just define the price inside these inputs as well. So for that, we can just move on to the inputs. We can just have here the price, and price will be equals to the data dot price, and in the image URL, and after this, and after in the new state as well, we need to add the price. So we need to add the price would be equals to an empty string as of now. What are we doing here? So we had missed the price tag inside that. So now we are entering the price as well, and the price here as well, and then we need to enter here the price here as well. So now instead of the image URL, so we need to add the price. and again we need to add the price here inside that. And after that, what are we doing here? And after that, we need to just move on to the add.js, and inside that we need to move on to the sendbook, and in the sendbook we need to add the price as well. So after the featured, we need to add the price again, and have the price, and it will be the number. So we are sending the value inside the string, so we need to convert it to the number as well. So it would be the data dot price. And now we can just move on again to the add.js, and then we are getting the value, and then we need to add the catch as well because it is a database operations, so we need to catch the error as well. So we will get the error, so we will just console.log the error as of now. So we can just have the console.log the error. We just now save. If we now just move on to the application once again, if we now just click on the add new, and then we need to add all of the fields here. So we need to add the title, it can be the atomic habits, we can have the author, it can be the James Clear. We need to add the image URL. So I have copied the image URL from somewhere, I will paste this, and after that we need to add the price, and the price can be equals to the 200. So we can just have the 200. So if we now just click on the submit, and now you can see now the book request is successful as we have the status equals to the 201. So if we just move on to the headers, now you can see now we have the status of the 201 which is created, and then you can see we have the payload that we have sent the data, and then inside the preview now we got the newly created book. We got the author as the James Clear, we got the featured false, we got the image URL, we got the price, and then we got the title, and then we got the ID of the newly created book as well. So now everything is working perfectly fine as we are able to create a new book from the front end as well. And now you will see the book is also created inside the all books page. So now everything is working perfectly fine. As if you will just go move on to the home, you can see all of the books. As if you will just move on to the home, you will see the featured books, and if you will just move on to the all books, you will see all of the books. And then if you will just add a new book, then you can see the new book will also be there inside the all books page. So everything is working perfectly fine. So now we have just completed the add book functionality as well. So now what we can do is now we can just move on to the book detail page, and then we can just complete the book detail functionality as well. So let's start with the book detail. So now as you can see, once you will move on to the edit, you can just click on the edit, and then you can see you are moving to the book detail page as well. And now for the book detail page, now what we can do is now we can just move on to the application, and we need to move on to the dynamic ID page of the books where the book detail is being rendered. And here after we'll move on to the book detail page, so we will just fetch that book from the use effect. So we will just grab the ID from that, from the URL, and then we will just fetch that book from the use effect, and then we will get the data, and then we will just render the data inside this form. So this is the logic of the book detail. So for that we can just move on to the components. We can just create the book detail page, we can have a book detail.js, and inside that we can just have here the RAFCE. And after that, first thing that we want to do is we need to grab this ID from the URL. So for that we need to import something from the Next.js. So we need to import the use router, and we need to import it from the Next.js. So we need to import it from the Rex router, and after that with the use router we will just access the router properties. So we can have a const router would be equals to the use router. So now we are giving the reference of the use router to this router variable, and after that we can just log these values of the router as well. So we can have the router dot query. So with the query we will get the value of the router as well from the query. And after the query, now we need to move on to the ID page, and then we need to call the book detail inside the ID page as well. So we need to remove this div, and then we need to have the book detail. So we need to import the book detail, and make sure you are not returning the book details. So you need to have the book detail. So if you will just save, if we will just move on to the application once again, if we now just refresh the page, we are into the localhost 3000/books and / the ID of the book, and then we are into the book detail page, and then you can see we also got an object. So if you will just open the object, then you can see we got the value of this ID, and then you can see we got the same ID as we got inside the URL. So now we got the ID, and now what we can do is now we can just run the use effect inside that, and then we will just fetch that book from the database. So for that we can again move on to the API helpers, and then into the front end in the utils.js, and then we will just have the export. We can have a const, we can have a get book from the ID. So we can have a get book from ID, and then we will just grab the ID from the URL, and then it would be an async function. So we need to get the IDs in the parameters, and after that we need to just fetch the book inside this function, and then we will call this function in the use effect. And again we can just get the book from the Axios. So we can have a const, we need to define the response variable would be equals to the await, it would be the Axios, dot get, and this would be a get request, and after that we need to pass the ID. So we need to just move on to the localhost 3000/books, and after /books we need to pass the ID. So we need to have here the ID /books as the ID of the book. So we can have this ID. I think the URL is also same. We can just move on and we can just verify the URL as well. So we can just move on to the pages API. We can have books, and we don't need to add the S inside that because it is in the books folder, and then we are into the ID page. So now this will be the URL of this request. After that, what we can do is now we can just check some validation, like if the response.status is not equals to the 200, which is okay, then we just need to return new error again, new error, and inside that error we can just have here the enable to fetch book, unable to fetch book from the given ID. And after that, what we can do is we can just define the parameter as the data, and it will be equals to the await. We can just have the response.data, and in the response.data we will just get the books. So now we can just return the data dot book inside that. So now this is what we want inside the get book ID. So now we will get the data in the await response.data. So the response.data will give you the actual data you got inside the response, and then what we are doing here is now we are now returning the book from the data. And now we can just move on to the book detail page, and then we can run here the use effect as well. We can just have here the use effect, and with the use effect we can just render here, and inside the use effect we need to add the callback, and after the callback in the second parameter we need to add the dependency list. So if we add the empty dependency list, empty array inside the dependency list, so use effect will be called after the component is being rendered. So use effect will be called once or twice after the component is being rendered. But if we provide any value inside this use effect, like we can just define the router dot query dot id. So what we will do here, so now we are just defining the query. So it means that whenever the query ID will be changed, the use effect will be called again. Like once the query will be changed inside the URL, the use effect will then rerun the component. And after that, what we can do is we can just call that function here. We can just have the get book from ID. We can just get this function from the front end utils. And after that, this needs a promise as well. And the get book from ID needs ID as well. So we can just destructure the ID as well from the router. So we can just have the const ID would be equals to the router dot, we can have the query dot ID. So we will just get the ID from this ID, and inside this get book from ID we need to pass here the ID. So this is what we need. So we are now just defining the get book from ID, and now what we can do is now we need to just store the data that we will receive from this function. So for that again we need the use state. So we can have again the use state snippet, and inside that we can have the book, we can have the set book, and after that by default value will be undefined, and then we need to import the use state as well. So after that the get book from ID, this returns a promise. So we can just have the then statement, and in the then it needs the data, and in the then it will receive the data, and after the data we will just have the set book, it would be the data. So we can have the data inside the set book, and after that what we can do is we can just run the catch as well, because it's a database operation and it can fail as well. So we will just log the value of the error as well. So we are just defining the get book from ID, and then we are passing the ID, then we are rendering the data as well, and then after everything will be successful we will just log the data. We will just log the newly fetched book. So we can just log the data of the book. If we just now save, if we just now move on to the application, now you can see now we got the book as well. Inside that we got the ID of the book, the ID is same, and then you can see we have the title start with Y, and then we have the author, we have the price, we got the image URL, and then we got everything with that. So everything is working perfectly fine. And now what we can do is now we can just send this data inside this form as well. So as we have just created the form and it was a reusable component, so we can just use this form inside the book detail as well. So then we can just render here something. So inside this div what we can do, so we can have here a condition like when we will have the book, because the use effect runs after the component is being rendered. So once we will have the book, then we need to render here the form. So with that we need to render here the form, and with the form we need to add here the data as well. So in the detail page we need to send the data, and the data will be equals to the book. So if we have the book, then we need to pass here the data, and then we need to pass the onSubmit function as well to get the data of this form. For the onSubmit function as well we need to declare a function. So it can be const, it can be a get form data again. So we can have a get form data. It would be equals to a function which will get the data in the parameters. After that, what we can do is we can just point to this get form data function. So the get form data. So now what are we doing here is now we are now pointing the onSubmit function to the get form data, and it will just pass the event to this get form data, and then we will just receive the data in the form of event with that. Everything is working perfectly fine, and after we got the book, then we are fetching this. And else, in the else case, we can just define a paragraph tag again. So we can just have a normal paragraph tag, and then we can just have the unable to load. So we can just have the unable to load book with that. So if we just now save, if we just now move on to the application, so now once we will move on to the home page, and then you can see once we will just click on the edit, and then you can see we got the unable to load book, and then we got the book detail as well. And now you can see we got all of the properties as well inside that. We got the featured as well, we got the price as well, we got the image URL, we got the James. And once we will move on again to the home, and then once we will move on, and once we will click any of the book, like in the all books, once I will move on to any book like in the Art of War, if we now just click on the edit, and then you can see we got all of the properties of the book as well. And then you can see we got the book detail as well from that. So everything is working perfectly fine. And then you can see instead of the unable to load book, we can just pass here the loading state. So we can have a loading only. So now once I will move on to the home or any of the page, once I will just click on the edit, then you can see we got the loading, and then we got this data. And you can also just remove this loading state as well. So you can just move on to the ID page, and then you can also use here the get server side props if you don't need the loading page. And I am using the use effect because I don't need to pre-render this page into the HTML page. So if you will just move on to the inspect or into the page source, and then you can see you won't get the data inside this page. So that like now you can see you will not get any data inside this HTML page, because now we don't need the SEOs to work on the detail page because it would be useless. So I'm using here the use effect, and if you want to render it onto the server side and into the page source as well into the HTML file for the SEOs, you can just write here the get server side props, which is very dynamic, which you will get the ID, and then the server side props will be then called first, then the component function would be then called, then you will get the data before rendering the component function. So that is the functionality of the get server side props. And now you can see now we got the data of this form as well. And now what we can do is now we can just move on to the book detail page. So after we got the data, we can just log the data as well. We can just log the updated data of the form. So we can get the data. If we just now save again, if we just remove everything, or if we just change the data, like we have the quiet book, if we just click on the submit, and now you can see we got the updated book, we got the quiet book, and all of the things are now available as well. Now what we can do after we got the data, we can just call the function to update that data inside the database. So for that, what we can do again, we can just move on to the utils folder, and inside this utils folder we can just define one more function. It can be export const, it can be the update book, so we can have update book, and it will also be an async function. So we can just have here the async, and it will get the data again inside the parameters as well. And after this, what we can do again, we can just move on to the const response. So we need a response from the Axios. So again it would be the wait, it would be the Axios, but it would be a put request. So it will not be a get or post request, it will be a put request, because we have just defined the put request for update book. So with the put request again we need to pass the ID. So we need to pass the same ID as we are now just defining here for the get book from ID. We need to just pass here the same ID. So we need to add the backticks as well. After that, what we can do in the second parameter, we need to pass here the data, and again as we did in the post request, we need to send here the data. So we can just copy these properties as we got, and then we can just paste these properties here as well. So like now in the data, we need to add the title, we need to add the author, we need to add the image URL, we need to add the featured, and then we need to add the price as well. Now after we have just defined here the data, so we need to just get the ID as well. So we need the ID as well. So before the data parameter, we need the ID as well, and after that we need the data. And now what we can do is now again we can just have here the validation, like if the response.status is not equals to the 200, and then we can just return a new error again, new error, and the new URL will be unable to update the book. And after that, if the response.status is the 200 and the book is now updated, we can just get the updated data. So we can have a response data would be equals to the await, and then again we need to get the data from the response. So we got the response.data, and after that we need to just return the response data as well. So if we just now save, if we just now move on again to the book details page, and now we need to just call this function here. So we need to call the update book. So the update book is now called, and now we need to pass here the ID. So for the ID we need to pass the ID as we got in the URL. Then we need to pass here the data. If we just now save, and now we need to remove log as well. So if we just now move on to the application, now you can see if we now remove everything from there, if we now just change the author of it, like it can be a Johnson, and then we need to remove the book as well. So just if we now just click on the submit, and now we should see the updated data here as well. So if I will now just click on the submit, I think we didn't got here something, but if we just move on to the network tag to see if the response is successful or not, so I think we don't have anything here. So if we just move on to the home to check if the book is now updated, and now you can say inside the quiet we got the book as the updated, and now you can see the Johnson is there. So now the book is also updated. So again we can just click on the edit, and then we can just move on, and then we have the quiet, we have the Johnson. So if we just now move on and change the Johnson to the Michael, so if we now just click on the submit, and now we should see the request to be sent from here. We can just click on the submit, and now you can see the request is now sent, and then we have the status of the 200 as well. Then you can see we have the status code as the 200, which is okay, and then we got the message as well as the successfully updated. So now everything is working perfectly fine, and now we are able to add the book, we are able to get all of the books, we are able to get the featured books, and now we are able to update this book as well. So now the only functionality which is remaining is now the delete functionality. But before that, now what we want to do is, now once the book is now updated, so inside the get form data we need to just have here the values as well. We can just have here the then statement, and then we will just get here the value. So after the value we will just log here the value as well. So we have the console.log as the value. So after this we need to add the catch as well. So the catch, we will get the error, so we will just log the error. So we can just have the console.log the error as well. Console.log the error. If we just now save, if we just now move on to the application, if we now just click on the home page, and then you will see once I will just click on the start with Y, once I will just click on the edit, now you can see we got the author as the James. We need to change the author, like it can be a John. So if we now just click on the submit again, we can just remove everything from the console. If we now just click on the submit, and then you can see we got the message from the backend. So this was the message that we created from the backend as successfully created, and now you can see we got this message as well into the front end. And now the next step is, now what we can do is, now once the book is updated, so once the book is now updated, we can just redirect to the home page as well. So for that, what we can do is, now we can just have here another then statement with that. So we can have the then, and inside this then, now what we can do is we can just call a function. So as we are just getting the router value, so inside the then we can just have the router dot push. So we need to push the URL to the slash, which is the home page. So if we now just save, if we now just move on to the application, like if we now just click on the edit, and then we need to change the author, we need to just remove here the James, we need to just have the Carvin. So if we now just click on the submit, and now we should be moved to the home page as well. So if we now just click on the submit, and now you can see we got the mindset, and then we got the author as the Carvin, and now you can also see that we are now into the home page as well. So now the redirection is also working perfectly fine. So now everything in our application is working perfectly fine, and now the only thing which is remaining is the delete functionality. So now we need to also work on the delete functionality as well. Now the book detail is completed, and now we need to work on the delete functionality. And for the delete functionality, we don't need to create a separate component for the delete, because now for the delete we need to just click on the delete button, and now this book should be deleted. So for that, we can just move on to the book item.js, where we are rendering all of the books, and where we are rendering every single book. And with the every single book, now we have the button of the delete. So we can just provide here a function into the onClick function of the button, and then inside the onClick function we will just handle the state of the delete as well. So we will just make a request to the delete, and then we will just refresh the page. So the product should be deleted. So for that, we can just provide the onClick, and the onClick will be equals to a function which can be a handle click. In the onClick we can have a function of the handle delete. So we can have the handle delete with on the on click function with that. So now we can just pass here a handle delete function. So we can have a handle delete. So in the handle delete function, what we can do is, now first we need to make a request to the database to delete that product, and now we got the ID of the product as well, and now we need to delete that book as well. We again need to move on to the utils.js, and then we can just create a separate function. So we can have export const, it can be delete book, so it can be delete book, and it will be equals to a function which will just get the ID inside that. So it will get the ID, and it is also asynchronous function, so we need to add the async before the parameter as well. And after that, now we need to pass the URL. So the URL should also be again the same. So we need to add the same URL because we need the ID of the book to delete that well as well. So we need to get the same URL. It will not be a get request, it would be a delete request. So we need to just have here the delete because it's a delete type of request. After that, again we can just have some validation, like if the response.status is not equals to the 200, then again we need to just return new error. We can just have this error, and inside the error we can just have the message like unable to delete. After that, if we passed this validation check, then we can just have the data. So we can just have the response data again. It would be equals to the await. It would be the response.data. So we will just get the data, then we will just return the data here. So this is all for the delete function. So now we have just created the function for the delete. We are defining the response, and then if we got the data, then we need to just return the data as well. So we need to return the response of data, and now we need to just move on to the book item.js, and now we need to pass here this function. So we need to call here this function. So we can call the delete book from there. So we need to just call this function, and now we need to pass here the ID. So as we are getting the ID inside the props, we need to pass here the ID. So it's a promise, then we need to just have here the then as well. So we have the then, and then we will get here the value as well. So we will get the response value, and then we will just log the value. So we can have a console.log the value. So we will just log the value as well inside the console.log. We can see that if everything works fine, we have defined the on click for the delete, and then we are having the console.log value. So we need to add the catch statement as well. If we got an error, we can have a catch error. If we got an error, so we will just log the error as of now. We got the error. If we now save, so now we can say, if we now just move on to the home, and we now move on to the all books, and now you can see this book has the different title, but the image is also different. So we can just delete that book. So once I will just click on the delete, so I should be move on to the, now we need to move on to the inspect, and then we need to just move on to the console as well. Now we need to just remove everything from there. So if we just now click on the delete, now this book should be deleted, and now you can see we got the message as well as the successfully deleted. So now you can see we got the message as well as the successfully deleted. So everything is working perfectly fine in our application. So now the CRUD operation in our application is completely fine, and now CRUD is working perfectly fine. And now you can see we have an error, like the book is deleted, but we can still see the book here. But if we just refresh the page, and if the component will re-render, the book will be gone. Like now you can see this is an error because now the state is not updated and the component is not re-rendered. So for that, what we can do is we can just set a notification for the delete. So if we just click on the delete, and there should be a notification of the delete, like this book is deleted, and then it will just update the state inside the component, and the component will re-render. So for that, what we can do is we can just move on to the appui.com, the material UI, and inside that what we can do is we can just search for the snack bar. So we have a snack bar component inside the material UI which works on the notifications tab, which helps in the notifications. So we can just move on to the snack bars. Now you can see, if you will just click on the open simple snack bar, now you can see we got this notification, and now we need the same notification with that. So we got the snack bar. So the snack bar is a component. So with the open, if the open is true, the snack bar will be open, and then you can see we have the auto hide duration. So in the auto hide, after the 6 seconds, so we need to pass here the milliseconds. So after 6 seconds, the snack bar will be closed, and then you can see we have the on close, and then you can see the handle close function is there. So we need to just update the state of the open. After that, we need to pass here the message, and we need to pass here if there is an action. So we need to pass here an action with that. So now you can see this snack bar is looking good. So we can just grab this snack bar, and now we can see if you will just click on the open success snack bar. So now you can see this is a success message. So we can just grab this snack bar with that. So what we can do is we can just get this snack bar from there. So we need to get this snack bar. After that, what we can do is now we can just render this snack bar after the card has been completed. So we can just have here a fragment from the React. So we can just have here the fragment. And now inside this fragment, what we can do is now we can just move on the card inside this fragment. So the card should be moved inside the fragment. After that, we can just render here the snack bar as well. So we can just copy that snack bar. Then we can just paste this snack bar as well. Now you can see we have the snack bar, but now you can see the states are still there. So we can just work on the states. So we can just define here the use state as well inside that. So we can have a use state again. So we need to import the use state, and then you can see we can have the property of the open and the set open, and the by default value will be equals to the false. And now you can see now we need to work on that as well. So now you can see we have the snack bar. So for the open, the value would be equals to the open, and for the auto hide duration, we need to change the duration of the 1 second. So we need to add the 1000 milliseconds to add it to the 1 second. Then you can see in the on close, we cannot create a separate component here. So we can just have here a function inside that, or it can be just a set open, and it can be equals to the false. What are we doing here is now we are just declaring the open as the open, then we have auto hide duration as the 1 second, and then in the on close we have the set open equals to the false. So after 1 second, if we pass the auto hide duration, so after 1 second the on close function will be then called, and then the set open will be equals to the false. This will be closed. If you don't know about these components in the material UI, so I have a separate tutorial on the material UI, you can watch it as well. So now we need to wrap this inside this conditions as well. So now we can have the condition like once it will be open, and then only we need to render this snack bar. So if the open is equals to the true, then only we need to render here this snack bar as well. And now we need to import this snack bar. So we need to import that snack bar. Then we need to import this alert as well. And now you can see we have the handle close function inside the alert as well. So again inside the handle close, what we can do is we can just have here the set open, and it would be equals to the false. So we need to render it inside the callback as well. So now you can see we have the set open is equals to the false, we have the severity equals to the success, we can have the severity equals to the error as well. But now what we can do is we can just have here the success, and then you can see we have the width as well equals to the 100%. So if you don't need the width equals to the 100%, you can just decrease the width. After that, we can just have here the message. So we can have the successfully deleted. So now the snack bar is created, and now what we can do is now we can just move on to the handle delete. So after the delete operation is completed, now what we can do, we can just have here the set open. We need to just set the notification tab open to the true. So now we don't need that value as well, so we can just remove that value, because now we are just having the same message as we sent from the backend. So we have this successfully deleted. If we just now save, if we just now move on to the application, we can refresh the page. So if we just now delete any of the book, like if I will not just delete the book as the Art of War, if we now just click on the delete, and now you can see we got the message as they successfully deleted, and now it was closed as well. Now what we can do, and now you can see the notification component was being rendered only for a very short duration. So we can just change the duration to the 3 seconds. So after 3 seconds, the set open will be then called, and now the successfully deleted will be then shown. And now I have added the Atomic Habit books around 3 times. So there are the duplicate books. Once I will just click on delete, and then you can see there will be a message of successfully deleted, and it will be automatically closed after 3 seconds. So after 3 seconds, the set open will be then called to the false, and then it will be deleted. So once I will refresh the page, and now you can see now we have the only single book inside that. So all of the functionalities are now completed in our application. And now the next thing that we want to do is now we want to just refresh the page. So for that, now what we can do, so after the set open is then called, so after we have the set open equals to the false, then what we can do is we can just have a function instead of the set open. So instead of this function, so first there will be a set open, and after that what we can do, so now we can just import the router from the Next.js. So again we can import the router. So we can have a cons router will be equals to the use router. So we can have a use router inside that, and now we need to import the router as well. So we can just import the router. We can import the use router, and it would be from the Next.js router, from Next-router. So now the use router is now imported, and now what we can do, So after the set open is now equals to the false, then what we can do is now we can just reload the same page. So for reloading the same page, we can just call the router.push, and then we need to just open the same page slash books. So the same page slash books will be then recalled again. So now you can see we have some duplicate books of the atomic habits. Once I will just click on the delete, and then you can see we have the message of the successfully deleted, and then after 3 seconds it will be called, and now you can see after 3 seconds the page is now reloaded, and now you can see everything is now working perfectly fine in our application. So now we have completed this project. So now the project is now completed, and now what we can do is now we can just optimize some things in our project. Now you can see now we got the feature tab. So now you can see the feature is not looking good here. So now what we can do is now we can just change the color of the feature. So you can see we have the background color of this. So we can just remove the background color. So we can just change the background color to the red, and then you can see now we got the featured as the red color inside that. And now what we can do is now we are missing one thing inside that. So we are missing the price in all of the books. So we need to render this prices as well. So for the prices, what we can do is we can just move on to the book item. So we can just move on to the book list, and then we need to just send the price as well. So price would be equals to the books dot, it would be the price. The price is there, so it should be the book dot price, and after that we need to just move on to the book item. And in the book item, what we can do is now we can just accept the prop as the price. It would be the number, and now we can just display one more typography inside that. So now for the price, what we can do is now we can just create a one more typography. So we have a typography, and after the typography, what we can do is we can just add here the text of the price. So it can be in the string, and it can be the best buy. So we have a best buy, and then we can just add the dollar sign, or we can just add a rupee sign, or whatever. We can just add the dollar sign, and after that we can do is we can just pass here the expression of the dynamic expression, and it will contain the price of that. So if we just now save, and now you can see we got the price. Now you can see we got the best buy of the $200 because we have given the price at the $200 for every book. After that we can just define some more stylings to the typography. So we can just have here the font family. So the font family will be equals to, we can just add a monospace. So then you will see there will be a monospace font, and after that we can just define the stylings. We can just define the SX prop, and the SX we will define the margin from the top, and it will be equals to the 1. So then you will see we have the margin from the 1 from the top. After that the font should be bold, so we can just have the font weight. Font weight will be equals to the bold. So if we just now save, so now you can see the font weight is now bold for every style. So now you can see we have completed the styling of all of the books inside the page. Now you can see the price is now looking good, and now we have just defined the styles for the pricing as well. And now next thing that we want to do is we want to just add an icons to all of the edit and the delete buttons as well. So for that we can just move on to the MUI icons. So we have the MUI icons, and inside that we can just search for any icon. Like in there we can just search for the edit icons. So we can just search for the edit, and then you will see the edit icon will appear. So then now you can see now we can just select this edit icon. So we can just copy that, and then we can just move on to the book item, and then we can just paste this icon here, and then we can just search for the delete icon as well. So just search for the delete, then you can see now we got this delete icon. So we can just copy that, and then we can just paste the delete icon here as well. And now what we can do is now we can just move on to the buttons, and then we can just add some icons to the buttons as well. So the buttons we can just add the icons. So we have a prop of the end icon. So after the text, the end icon will be then called, and the end icon we can just specify that icon inside that. So we have the edit icon, so we can render the edit icon inside the end icon inside the edit, and then we can just copy, and then we can just paste for the delete, and then we can just render the delete forever icon. We have a delete forever icon inside that. If we just now save, if we just now move on to the application once again, and now you can see we got the edit and the delete icons as well inside that. So we got the edit, and then we got the delete as well. Now what we can do is now we can just move on to the home page, and now we need to just give basic style to the home page of our application as well. So either we can just provide some text on the top of all of the books, so that should be the featured or anything. So we can just provide that styling as well. And now to provide the styling, what we can do is now we can just move on to the book list.js, and inside that we can use the fragment. So we can have here the fragment. So in the fragment we can just wrap all of the items inside the fragment. So we can just wrap this div. So after that what we can do is now we can just have some data inside that. So if we have the featured page, Then we need to render here some data. So inside that we can just have here a box from the material UI. So we can just have here the box, and inside that box now we can just render some data. So in the box it will contain some stylings, like the box will contain the display, it can be equals to the flex, and then after that it will be equals to the flex direction, would be equals to the column. After that what we can do is now we can just define some typography inside that. So we can have the typography. The typography we can add some text inside that. So the typography will contain like the featured section. So if we just now save, if we just now move on to the application, now you can see now we got the featured section here as well, and now we need to just provide some basic stylings over there. So what we can do is now we can just move on to the box, which is the parent container. We can just define some shadow of the box. So we can have a box shadow. The box shadow will be equals to like 10 pixels from the horizontally, 10 pixels vertically, 20 pixels it should be the blur, and then we can just define the shadow color inside that. So we have the featured section, and after that now what we can do is we can just define the border colors. So we can have a BG color inside that. So in the BG color we can just provide the color as the hash. It can be 3D2870. If you will just provide that color, now you can see you have a purple color onto that. After that what we can do, we can just align the content into the center. So we can have a justify content into the center of the web page, and then we can just provide some color to the typography as well inside the typography. So we have the typography, we can have the color, it would be equals to, we can have the white color so that the text should be visible. We can just have the font family, we can just provide some different fonts as well. So we will do after this step. So we can have a text align into the center of the web page, and after that we can have a variant, it would be equals to the h2. So we need the h2 tag inside that. So now you can see now we got the featured section as well inside our application. After that we can just provide some margins, or we can just provide some paddings as well. So in the box we can just provide the margin. The margin would be equals to something aligned auto. Then you will see all of the things will be then aligned, and then we can just define the margin from the bottom, would be equals to, we can just give around 10 pixels. So then there should be some margin from the bottom as well, and then we can just provide some padding as the, we can just provide some padding as well, and after that we can just provide some padding as well, and the padding can be 3 or it can be the 2. So if we just now save, so now you can see now we got the padding as well from the top as well, and now you can see now we got the paddings as well. So now everything is working perfectly fine, and now what we can do is now we can just change the font of our application as well. So for changing the font, what we can do is now we can just move on to the Google Fonts, and then we can just select any of the font which we want. So for that you can select any of the font that you want. So we can just search for the font that we want. So I think the fonts are there. You can just search for any font. So I think this font will look good. So we can just click on that font, Ubuntu. Then we can just select any style with there. So we can just select this style. Then what we can do is we can just click on the import. So then we need to just import this style from there. So we need to import this CSS, and we can just copy that, and then we can just move on to the main application, and then we can just move on, we can just move on to the CSS file inside the styles, inside the global CSS. And now what we can do is now we can just import this style from there, and now we need to just paste this import statement on the top. After that what we can do is now we can just move on to the browser again, and then we can just copy this font family from there. So we can just copy this, and now we can just have here the star selector. After that we can just paste this tag here, and now we need to just provide some text of the Ubuntu inside our application. So we can just move on to the book item, and then we can just provide some styles to the typography as well. So we can have a font family, and then we can have a font family of the Ubuntu. So we can have the Ubuntu, and we can just provide same to all of the text fields as well. For this text field and for this text field as well, I think this should be the monospace. So now we need to just define some styles for this text field. So now you can see now we got the mindset, now we got the font as this as well, and then we got the price tag as well. And now we need to just define style for this text field as well. So we can just move on to the book list, and then inside this text field we need to provide this style. So we have font family of the Ubuntu, and now you can see now we got the featured section as well. And now what we can do is now we can just move on to the tabs as well. We can just provide some styles to the tabs. So we can just move on to the header. Then what we can do And now inside the tabs, now what we can do, this don't accept the font family, so we need to provide the SX prop. So we can have SX, it would be the font family. We can provide the font family of the Ubuntu. So we have a font family of the Ubuntu. So then we can just copy that SX for every other tab as well. We can have for this as well, for this tab as well. So if we just now save, so now you can see now the font is changed, and now you can see we have the different font onto the header as well. So everything in our application is completely fine, and now we need to change the font for this add book as well inside the forms as well. So we can just move on to the forms, and then we can just provide some styles to the forms as well. So we can have a font family, and it will be equals to the Ubuntu. So if we just now save, so now you can see now we got the Ubuntu text over here as well. And now you can see now this button color is not looking good, so we can just provide same button color of this navigation bar. And for that, what we can do is now we can just move on to the header, and then we can just copy that color from there, and then we can just move on to the form. We can just move on to the button, and then we can just provide the SX prop to the button as well. It can be the background. Background would be equals to this color, so we want this color into the background. If we just now save, so now you can see now we got same color of that. So now you can see now we got the same color, but once you will hover over it, and then you can see now we got the blue color as well. So then you can also change the hover color inside the SX, but I would not change it. Everything in our application is perfectly fine. And now the next optimization that we can do is now we can just move on to the book item, and then we can just align these buttons. So now you can see we can just have the edit button on this corner and the delete button on this corner. So for that, now what we can do is we can just provide the SX prop for this button, so it can have a margin from the right. So we need the margin right as the auto. It will just align the margin for both the buttons. And now you can see now we got the edit and the delete as well. Now you can see the buttons are now also looking good, and once you will move on to the home, then you can see now all of the things are now perfectly looking good. Next optimization that we can do is that we want these three products into the center of the web page. So we want all of the products that are featured into the center of the web page. So for that, now what we can do is again we can just move on to the book list, and then we can just add some styles into this grid. So inside this grid, what we can do, so as you know that the grid works on the flexbox, so we can just have this justify content into the center of the screen. So if you provide a justify content as the center, if you will just save, so now you can see now all of the three books are now into the center of the web page as well. So now you can see all three books are now into the center of the web page, and now we need one more optimization inside that. So it will just center all of the books inside these all books and inside the home as well. So we need to fix that. So what we can do is now we can just again move on to the grid, and then we can just have here the justify content inside the condition. If we have the featured page, then it would be inside the center, or else it would be inside the flex start. So we need all of the item inside the flex start. If we just now save, if we just now move on to the application, now you can see these are onto the center. But if we just move on to the all books, and then you can see we don't have any books, so we can just add a new book as well. So we can just have here the rich dad poor dad, and then we can just provide the author, and we can just provide the author, and it can be the author can be the robot. Then we can provide the image URL, so image URL will be this, and then we can provide the price, it can be the 500. Then if I will now just click on the submit, and then you can see if I will now move on to the all books, and now you can see these books will be then available there. And now you can see the rich dad poor dad is being rendered, and now you can see the stylings, I think the styling has been broken. And now what we can do is now we can just move on to the book item, and then where we are rendering the text, so we can just have here the font size, so we can just decrease the font size as well. So we need the font size of something around, it can be like 22 pixels for all of the screens. And after that we can just provide here, and then we can just provide here the width as well. So we need the width of this item into the 300 pixels. So we can have a 300 pixels of the width with that. So now all of the things are now working perfectly fine. And now the next optimization would be, now once I will just add a new book from the database, so the page doesn't refresh, so it doesn't redirect to the different URL. So to solve this problem, what we can do is now we can just move on to the addbook.js. So we have the addbook, and then now you can see once we will just get the form, once we will just send the data, and that we will get the value, then we can just have here the another then statement, and inside the then what we can do is we can just get the router. So again we need to import the router from the Next.js. So we need to import, it can be the use router, from the next router, and then what we can do is now we can just have here the reference of the router. So we have the const router would be equals to the use router hook, and then what we can do is now we can just have here the router dot push. So we need to push to a different URL, and it can be equals to the slash books page. So if we just now save, if we just now move on to the application once again, so if I will just add another book with that, so we can just add another book. If we now just click on the submit, now we should be redirected to the books, and now you can see now we are redirected to the all books, and now you can see we got this book as well. So everything in our application is perfectly working fine. So now we have completed this project. So our application is almost complete, but only till the development level. So we want to make it work for the production level, but if we want to make it work, so we have to fix two major issues inside our application. So the first issue is, so now we are into the home page, and once I will move on to the all books, and you can see we have the data. So this is working for the development, but it will not work for the production. So for the production, if we add a new book after the deployment of the application, so the new book will not be shown either into the all books page and even into the home page as well, because we have used the get static props, and the get static props is called once during the build process of our application. So after the application is being built, so we cannot add any book to the database. So the book will be added to the database, but it will not render here, because in here for fetching all of the books we have used the get static props, which is called during the build time and not after that. So we have to fix this problem. So we can fix this problem with the incremental static generation. We can provide here the revalidate key, which will just revalidate, or which will just rerun the get static props after several number of seconds. So we can provide the revalidate key for the incremental static generation, or we can use the get server side props inside our application. So now inside the home page, inside the index.js page, now what we can do, we can just go ahead with the get static props only, so we don't need to change that. But if we want to move on to the books index.js page, then we need to change the get static props to the get server side props, and the get server side props is called after every new request. So after every new incoming request, the get server side props function will be then called, and we can see the updated data inside that, but not for the home page, because with the home page we are only rendering the get static props, which are the static data inside our application. So first fix is, now we can just change the get static props to the get server side props. So this is the first fix of the application. So the first fix is completed. And about the second fix, if I want to tell you that you cannot call your own API that we have created inside the same application inside the get static props function, as per the rules of the Next.js, so you cannot call the API routes inside your application that we have just built. So if you have just different API deployed on any different server, then you can just call inside the get static props, but not the API that we have just created inside the same application inside the Next.js application. So this is the major issue that we currently have in our application. So we need to fix that. So for that, we need to change the data fetching logic inside the get static props. It will work inside the development mode as we have seen, but if we will just build our application, it will give you an error. So I will now show you the errors. So I will now just skip all of the tasks inside that, and I will now just build this application. We can build the npm, we can build that application with the npm run build. So then we have to wait till it completes the build process. Now you can see the build process is failed. But why? If you will just see the error, then you can see you have the error occurred pre-rendering page the index.js, and you can read more about that. So if I will not just follow this link, and now you can see now we have the pre-render error. So now there are some possible ways. So we have the make sure to move any non-pages out of the pages folder, and the code assumes that the prop is available or not, and then we have the values for all of the dynamic pages and all of the things. But the actual error is, now we cannot use our own API that we have just created inside the Next.js inside the same application. So we have just created the API inside the same application inside the API book, so we cannot call that API inside the get static props. But if you will just add here the get server side props, then it will work for you. If you will just build after that, if you will just have the npm run build, and then you will see the build process will be completed, because now you have the get server side props. But because the get server side props supports that API building, but not the get static props. And then you can see now the build process is completed successfully, because now we have used here the get server side props. But inside the home page of our application, inside the index.js page, we don't need to use the get server side props. We need the static data inside that for the SEOs. So we need to again change it to the get static props. So we need to fix the data fetching logic inside that. So as we all know that the get static props works on the server side and not on the client side. So we can have a fix, we can change the data fetching logic inside that. So we don't need to just get the featured books directly from any API helpers file. I need to remove this. And now what we can do, we can just call directly the API functions here. So we can just directly access the server side files here. So we can just move on directly to the database, and then we can just find all of these books from the database only. So we need to make a call from the database, and now the get static props will work like an API. So what we can do, the first thing that we want to do is we want to just declare here the books. So this will be the same function as we have just defined here. So we have just defined the same function inside the books controller. So we have the get all books. So we need to define same thing, and this is the only approach to use the get static props inside that. So we can just define that books, and then we can just try catch all of the books inside that as well. So now we can just move on to the index.pages. So we can have the let books, and then we can have the books equals to the book.find. So we can just directly access the models and all of the files, because the code inside the get static props will never be available onto the front end. So we can use these things inside that. Now what will be the approach after that? So after pasting this code, now what it will do, it will just fetch all of the books from the database inside that, and after that it will return an array, and it will return array of the objects. Then we can just filter the array, then we can just send the books inside the props. So what we can do, so the books.find returns the array, but inside the array every id will contain a new specific object. It will not be inside the strings, so it will be inside the specific object. So we want to make it work, so we want the IDs into the strings as well. So for that, if I will now just log the data inside that, and in the books I will now just send an empty data. So if I will now just save, and if I will now just run the application inside the development board, then I will show you that what I am talking about. So if I will now just rerun the application npm run dev, so then you will see the data will be there inside the console window. You can just maximize the console window here, and then you can see once I will just make a request to the localhost 3000. Now you can see we can have a console.log, but I think it won't work because now we are not connected to the database. So for that we can just connect to the database as well. So we can just await the await, and then we can have the connect to database. So we can just import this function for the connect to database. So I think that function will be inside this API helpers and inside the utils.js. So we have the connect to database function there. So we can just get this function here. So we can have the connect to database inside that, and then we need to import this function as well from the utils.js. And now this function is imported, and now we can just restart the application again. We can just rerun the application with the run dev, and then you can see once I will now just refresh the page of the localhost 3000. Once I will just make a request on the localhost 3000, then you can see now we got the data, and this is the ID that I was talking about. So in the ID you will get the new object ID, and inside that object ID you will get the actual ID. So we need to fix these IDs before rendering and before sending the data to the component. So for that, what we can do is we can just first stringify the data. So we can just get the data inside the text, then we will just convert the text into the JSON. So with that we can just have the const text, it would be equals to the JSON dot stringify. So we can just have the stringify all of the data inside that. So we will just have here the books the stringified format, and then it will return the text, it will return the string inside that. And after that what we can do, we can just have the const data, it will be equals to the JSON dot parse. So then we can just pass the data into the JSON, it will be there equals to the text. So after that, if you will just log the data here inside that again, if you will just have the console.log data instead of the books, if you will just save, if you will just again reload the home page, and then you can see now you got the data, and now you can see now you got the ID as well inside that. So now you can see you got the ID inside the string format. Now the everything will be working perfectly fine. And now what we can do is now we can just have the const featured books would be equals to, we can have the books. Now the featured book will be equals to the data. We can have dot filter method again. So we have the data dot filter, and inside the filter, inside the array dot filter, what we can do is we can just have here the book, and the and now we need to fetch only the featured books inside that. So only we need to render the book dot featured will be equals to the true. So we need to only fetch the books that we have the featured prop is equals to the true. After that, it will give you all of the featured books. Then you can just pass the featured books inside the books as well. So if you will just save, if you will just reload the application, if you will just reload the home page, and now you can see now you got all of the data again back inside our application. So now everything in our application is perfectly fine, and now we have made those two fixes as well. And now inside the home page we only have the static data. If you will just see the page source of the application, then you can see now you will get the static data as well. So now if you will search for the static data, like if we can search for the mindset, and now you can see now you got the book as the mindset as well. Everything is working perfectly fine. And if you will just search for the quiet book as well, so you search for the quiet, and then you can see you got the quiet book as well inside that. So now you can see you got the quiet book here. So everything is pre-rendered onto the page, and then the SEOs will also work perfectly in our application. But inside the all books page is now the server side page, which will be rendered through the server side and not onto the get static props. So everything in our application will work perfectly fine. And even if it works on the server side, if you will just move on to the pre-rendering of the page, if you will just move on to the page source of the page, even then still you will see all of the data will be pre-rendered onto the page as well. If you will search for the rich dad poor dad, and then you can see you got the data as well as the rich dad poor dad. So everything in our application will work perfectly fine. And now you can see we have the add new page as well, and everything will work perfectly fine. And now what we can do for the incremental static generation, so what we can do, so after the get static props is now called, so we can just provide here the key as the revalidate. So we can provide the key as the revalidate, because now the get static, because now as we have discussed, the get static props only runs once during the build time. So if we add a new featured book inside that, so it will not be rendered here. So we can just fix that also. So we can provide the revalidate key, which will be included in the incremental static generation. So the revalidate key requires a number, so we can just pass the number as the string, and the numbers counts for the second. So if we provide the number as the 10, then it will count the 10. So what it will do, so after every 10 seconds it will rerun the get static props. So if we provide the number to the 10, so we can provide the number to the 100, we can provide the number to 3600, so we can provide any number of seconds as well. So now I will provide the number as the 10. After every 10 seconds the get static prop will be then called, and then this is known as the incremental static generation inside our application. So now our application has the get static props, get server side props, incremental static generation, and all of the things, and even the client side data fetching as well. So now this is the full stack application that we have just created, which contains all of the features of the Next.js, like how to create the API, how to call the API, how to call internal API in your application, and all of the things inside our application as well. So now after that, now we can just close this build. Now we can just close the server, and now we can just build our application. So we can just build the application with the npm run build, and now there should not be any errors inside our application. I hope there are no any errors. Now you can see the build process in our application is completed, and now you can see all of the things are now working perfectly fine. And now we can run the npm start to run the build file inside that. So with the npm start, it will run the production build in our application. So we need to run the npm start, and after that, now what we can do is now we can just reload the localhost 3000. And now you can see these are the static books, and now you can see these are the static books. And once you will just click on the edit, and then you will see it will be very fast, and it will be loaded very fast inside that. And then you can see we have the quiet book, and then we have the start with y as well. Once I will just move on to the all books, and now you can see the request will be made to the backend, and then all of the books will be then pre-rendered to the page as well. And the request is made not from the client side but from the server side only. After that, we have the add new page as well, in which we can add a new book to the database as well. Everything in our application is completely working fine. So this is the project that we have built inside the Next.js. So we have made use of every Next.js concept, like pages, we have the routes, we have the pre-rendering of the pages, we have the client side data fetching, we have the server side data fetching, and for the get static props, get server side props, incremental static generation, and almost all of the features of the Next.js that we can use. So this is the final application build that we wanted to create. So that's all for this project. So now let's see the summary part of what we have done. So we have created the API inside that application. So we have created the API for the getting the data, for adding the data into the database, so for deleting, for updating the data, and for getting the specific data inside that. So we have created that API, and then we have just integrated that API into the front end, and then we have rendered the data inside the file based routing. So we have created the file based routing as well, like into the books slash add slash the ID of the book slash updation of the book as well. And then we have done the pages pre-rendering. So we have pre-rendered the all of the data inside that application with using the get static props with the get server side props as well. And then we have made a modern UI UX full stack application with the React and the Material UI as well. So this is all about this video. So thanks for watching this video, and I hope you will like the video as well. So please subscribe to the channel as well, so I should be motivated to post these projects like this.